Get out and stay out, my father shouted, throwing my cheap suitcase onto the wet concrete of the porch like I was nothing but garbage. I wiped my tears, looked him dead in the eye and whispered, "Are you sure?" Because what he did not know was that tomorrow morning I was flying to a $40 million Hawaii mansion that I secretly owned, and 3 days later, he would be the one crying and begging outside my solid iron gates. My name is Maya Sterling. I am 29 years old, and for my entire adult life, I have worked as an unassuming corporate auditor for my family's logistics company. To my father, Richard, and my older sister, Jessica, I was just the quiet, reliable workhorse. I was the one who balanced the books, paid the bills, and fixed their endless mistakes while they lived lavishly and took all the credit. I sacrificed my youth, my savings, and my sleep to keep our family afloat, believing that one day my loyalty would finally earn their love. But love in the Sterling household was never about loyalty. It was about how much you could be exploited before you broke. I learned exactly how little I meant to them on a freezing Friday night in Seattle. The rain was coming down in sheets, hammering against the windows of the house I had essentially paid for over the last 5 years. I had just walked through the front door, exhausted after a grueling 60-hour work week, still wearing my damp trench coat, before I could even take off my shoes. My father charged down the hallway. His face was twisted with a kind of rage I had never seen before. He was holding a stack of financial ledgers, his knuckles white from gripping the paper so hard. Jessica was standing right behind him, her arms crossed over her designer silk blouse, wearing a cold, calculated smirk that sent an immediate chill down my spine. Standing next to her was her husband, Marcus. Marcus was a highly successful, sharp-suited real estate broker who had always intimidated me. He looked at me with profound disgust, completely manipulated by whatever lies my father and sister had just fed him. He truly believed I was the villain. Without a single word of greeting, my father threw the ledgers directly at my chest. The heavy papers scattered across the hardwood floor. He stepped closer, his voice vibrating with absolute malice, and accused me of embezzling $200,000 from his company. I was completely paralyzed. My hands started to shake violently as I tried to process the sheer insanity of his accusation. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to tell him I would never steal a single dime, but he did not let me speak. He grabbed my coat, shoved me toward the door, and screamed that I was the trash of the family. He told me I had exactly 10 seconds to get off his property before he called the police. The old me would have collapsed right there on the floor, begging for a chance to explain, begging for a family that never existed. But as I stood there in the freezing rain, watching the people I had given everything to look at me with such venom, the desperate pleading girl inside me finally died. The freezing Seattle rain did not just fall that Friday night. It battered against the pavement like shattered glass, stinging my skin and soaking through my cheap fabric trench coat, the exact moment I stepped out of my car. I was 29 years old, and I had just finished another grueling, mind-numbing 60-hour work week. My eyes burned relentlessly from staring at endless digital spreadsheets. My back ached from hunching over a cramped, poorly lit desk, and my mind was entirely numb with the sheer exhaustion of carrying my family's massive financial burdens. For years, I had been the unassuming, invisible corporate auditor for my father's mid-sized logistics company. I was the silent, underappreciated engine that kept his consistently failing business afloat, working quietly in the background while he took all the credit and lived dangerously beyond his means. I parked my beat-up decade-old sedan on the street carefully, leaving the pristine covered driveway open for my sister's luxury SUV, just as I was always strictly instructed to do. I grabbed my worn canvas work bag and walked up the cracked concrete path toward the front porch, craving nothing in this world more than a hot shower and a few uninterrupted hours of sleep. I never even got the chance to turn the brass doorknob. Before my cold fingers could reach for my keys, the heavy oak front door was violently thrown open from the inside. The sudden blinding burst of warm yellow light from the hallway was immediately eclipsed by the towering, enraged figure of my father, Richard. He did not say hello. He did not ask how my long day was or why I was standing alone in the freezing downpour. Without a single word of warning or hesitation, he stepped onto the porch and hurled my battered, faded suitcase directly at my chest with all his strength. The heavy impact knocked the breath completely out of my lungs. The suitcase hit the wet concrete with a sickening hollow thud. The cheap metal zipper busted open on impact, spilling my modest clothes, my favorite worn-out sweaters, and my few personal belongings directly into the dark, muddy puddles forming rapidly on the porch. I stared at my entire life scattered on the wet ground, my exhausted mind struggling desperately to process the sheer, unprovoked violence of the moment. Then the screaming started. My father lunged forward, his face flushed a dark, dangerous purple that I had never seen before. The thick veins in his neck were popping, visibly straining against his starched white collar as he pointed a trembling, accusatory finger right at my face. He roared over the deafening sound of the storm, his voice cracking with pure, unfiltered venom. He accused me of embezzling $200,000 from his logistics company. He called me a filthy thief. He called me an ungrateful parasite. He screamed that he had spent the entire afternoon reviewing the quarterly financial ledgers, that he had miraculously found the missing funds hidden in dummy accounts, and that he knew exactly what I had done to ruin his legacy. The sheer audacity of his words hit me infinitely harder than the physical blow of the suitcase. $200,000. I stood there violently shivering the icy rain, matting my dark hair to my face, listening to the man whose business I had single-handedly salvaged, scream that I was intentionally destroying him. I was the one who caught his catastrophic accounting errors year after year. I was the one who negotiated tirelessly with furious vendors when he carelessly missed vital payments. I was the one who quietly sacrificed my own meager salary bonuses to make sure his warehouse employees got paid before the winter holidays. My freezing hands balled into tight, shaking fists at my sides. A hot, suffocating wave of extreme injustice rose sharply in my chest. I wanted to scream back at the top of my lungs. I wanted to grab him by the collar of his expensive shirt and tell him that I knew the absolute truth. I knew exactly where every single cent of that missing $200,000 had actually gone. But the angry words caught thick in my throat, choking me into silence as my eyes drifted past his raging, screaming figure to the dry, warmly lit hallway right behind him. Standing there perfectly shielded from the brutal, freezing storm was my older sister, Jessica, the pampered, untouchable, highly celebrated golden child of the Sterling family. She was wearing a pristine white cashmere sweater and tailored designer slacks, casually holding a crystal glass of expensive red wine. She leaned comfortably against the wooden doorframe, watching my entire world collapse with an expression of pure, unadulterated amusement. A slow, incredibly cruel smirk crept across her flawless, glowing face. It was the distinct, arrogant look of someone who had just played a masterful game of chess and was thoroughly enjoying watching her opponent's king fall off the board. Jessica had always been the absolute favorite. Growing up in our house, her minor tears were treated as national emergencies, while my academic and professional achievements were completely ignored. She was the one who received brand new luxury cars, with big red bows on her birthdays, fully funded European vacations, and endless showering praise for simply existing. I was treated like the family's personal indentured servant, expected to clean up her massive financial messes and applaud her existence without question. And now she was happily watching our father throw me out into the dark street like a stray, diseased dog, knowing full well that she was the sole calculating architect of this entire nightmare. She was the one drowning in secret offshore gambling debts. She was the one who had forged internal documents and drained the company accounts to save her own skin. But looking at her smug, deeply arrogant face, I realized she felt absolutely zero remorse for setting me up to take the fall. To her, I was just a highly convenient scapegoat. I was a disposable piece of human trash to be sacrificed because the federal IRS audit was looming much too close and she desperately needed someone else to burn in her place. But what truly twisted the knife agonizingly deep into my chest, what almost brought me to my knees in that freezing rain, was the man standing right beside her in the hallway. Marcus, Jessica's husband. Marcus was a highly successful African-American real estate broker, a brilliant man who had built a massive commercial property empire from the ground up through sheer grit, unmatched intelligence, and relentless hard work. He was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit, looking every bit the powerful, commanding executive he was known to be in the corporate boardroom. I had always deeply, profoundly respected Marcus. He was driven, principled, and fiercely protective of his family. He had always treated me with a quiet, polite dignity that my own blood relatives never bothered to show me. But right now, his dark, expressive eyes were fixed squarely on me, and the heavy look in them made my breath catch painfully in my throat. It was a look of profound, crushing, absolute disappointment. Marcus had been completely and entirely manipulated by Jessica and my father. They had clearly spent the entire afternoon feeding him a masterful, highly coordinated web of lies, painting me as a jealous, bitter, thieving sister who was intentionally bleeding their family dry out of pure spite. Because he deeply loved his wife and because he trusted his father-in-law implicitly, he believed their vicious narrative without question. He looked at me not just as a common corporate criminal, but as a vile betrayer of blood and family trust. He shook his head slowly, his strong jaw tight with visible sickening disgust, and he stepped slightly in front of Jessica, placing his large body between us as if to physically protect his wife from my supposed toxic presence. Seeing this genuinely good, honorable man look at me like I was a highly dangerous monster was almost more than my shattered heart could bear. My family had successfully poisoned the only person in this toxic orbit who had ever shown me a single ounce of genuine respect, turning him into yet another weapon against me. The old me would have shattered into a million pieces right then and there on the porch. The old Maya, the desperate, pathetic, people-pleasing girl who had spent 29 exhausting years shrinking herself to perfectly fit into their conditional love, would have fallen directly to her knees on that wet concrete. I would have sobbed uncontrollably until my throat was raw and my voice completely gave out. I would have begged my father to look at the real accounting files, pleading with him to see the truth. I would have begged Jessica to stop lying and confess what she had done. I would have desperately tried to convince Marcus that I was completely innocent, that I was actually the one trying to save them from financial ruin. I would have sacrificed my last remaining shred of human pride and basic dignity just to be allowed back inside that warm, dry house. I would have promised to work twice as hard, to fix it all, to somehow find a way to pay back the massive amount of money I never even took just so they would not abandon me alone in the dark. But standing in the pouring, relentless rain, watching my father's hateful, twisted face, Jessica's triumphant evil smirk, and Marcus's tragically misplaced disgust, something deep inside me irrevocably snapped. It was not a loud, dramatic break. It was a quiet, profound, permanent severing of the heavy, invisible chains that had bound me to these toxic people my entire life. The desperate, pathetic need for their validation evaporated instantly from my veins, washed away entirely by the freezing downpour. The fragile illusion of family dissolved into absolute nothingness. In its place, a chilling total and absolute calm washed over my entire body, starting from the center of my chest and radiating out to my freezing fingertips. It was a physical sensation of pure, terrifying clarity. The lingering fear was completely gone. The deep sorrow was gone. The agonizing, suffocating pain of rejection was permanently gone. The only thing left in my mind was cold, calculated, unforgiving resolve. I was no longer the helpless, crying victim they thought they were discarding so easily. I was no longer the quiet, obedient auditor they confidently thought they could manipulate, frame, and send to a federal prison without a fight. I was a highly intelligent woman holding a royal flush, quietly watching her foolish opponents push all their chips into the center of the table on a desperate, pathetic bluff. My father stepped aggressively forward, closing the distance until his face was mere inches from mine, completely unaware of the massive seismic psychological shift that had just occurred within me. The cold rain dripped heavily from his nose and chin, but he was so consumed by his own fabricated rage that he did not seem to notice the storm at all. He drew in a deep, ragged breath, his chest expanding vastly as he prepared to deliver his final, supposedly devastating blow to my spirit. "You are the trash of this family," he roared, his voice echoing loudly and violently down the quiet, affluent suburban street. "Get out and stay out." He stood there, panting heavily, fully expecting me to break down. He waited eagerly for the tears to fall, for the pathetic, desperate begging he was so deeply accustomed to seeing from me whenever he raised his voice. He waited for the twisted satisfaction of breaking my spirit one final, ultimate time. Instead, I slowly raised my right hand and calmly wiped the cold rain and splashing mud from my cheek. I took a very slow, deliberate, steadying breath. I straightened my posture, pulling my shoulders back, no longer shrinking or cowering under his intimidating gaze. I looked him dead in the eye, holding his furious stare with an icy, unblinking intensity that made him momentarily falter. I did not raise my voice in defense. I did not yell out in anger. I did not try to defend my innocence. I simply leaned forward and whispered soft enough that only he could hear the highly dangerous razor-sharp edge in my tone. "Are you sure?" He blinked rapidly, visibly taken aback. He was momentarily thrown completely off balance by the absolute chilling lack of fear in my eyes, deeply confused by the eerie, unnatural stillness of my reaction. But his towering, lifelong arrogance quickly swallowed his fleeting confusion. He sneered at me with pure, unadulterated contempt, grabbed the heavy brass doorknob of the front door, and slammed it shut with a deafening, violent crack that reverberated through my bones. The heavy metal deadbolt clicked loudly and securely into place, locking me out of their toxic lives forever. I stood completely alone on the dark porch for a long, quiet moment, listening to the relentless drumming of the heavy rain against the porch roof. The freezing water soaked completely through my clothes, chilling me to the absolute core, but I did not shiver once. I looked down at my ruined suitcase, at the wet clothes scattered carelessly across the muddy concrete, and a slow, genuine, highly dangerous smile formed on my lips. They truly thought they had just discarded a helpless, weak scapegoat. They actually believed they had perfectly executed their master plan to frame me and save their own skins. They had absolutely no idea that they had just locked themselves inside a burning building, and I was the one walking away with the only key. The trap was set. The timer was ticking, and karma was already on its way. I did not sleep on the wet concrete that night. I did not wander the freezing streets of Seattle, looking for a cheap motel, shivering in my damp clothes, weeping over a broken family. My father and sister confidently assumed I would be utterly destroyed, begging at the gates of some homeless shelter, completely reliant on the meager scraps of pity society might throw my way. They were wrong. Less than 5 hours after my father violently hurled my battered suitcase onto the porch, I was thousands of feet in the air, leaning back into the deep plush leather of a private first-class suite on a red-eye flight to Maui. The cabin was completely silent, bathed in a soft, warm enamel glow that felt like a protective embrace. I held a crystal glass of sparkling water in my hand. The ice clinked softly against the rim, a quiet, steady rhythm that matched the deep, powerful hum of the jet engines beneath me. The stark contrast between the icy, muddy puddles of my father's front porch and the luxurious, absolute tranquility of this first-class cabin was almost difficult to process. I took a slow sip of the cold, sparkling water, letting the crisp bubbles wash away the lingering, bitter taste of their betrayal. My clothes were dry. My heart rate was perfectly steady. As I looked out the small oval window at the endless sea of silver cloud illuminated by the bright full moon, a profound sense of peace washed over my entire body. I was finally free. For years, my father, Richard, looked at me and saw nothing but a pathetic, unimaginative failure. In his arrogant mind, I was just a low-level corporate auditor, a sad, lonely woman desperately clinging to a miserable $45,000 a year salary. He firmly believed I was completely dependent on his generosity, surviving solely because he allowed me to live in his house and work for his failing logistics company. He looked at my worn-out sweaters, my 10-year-old sedan, and my quiet, unassuming demeanor, and he saw a spectacular loser. He thought I spent my evenings calculating his messy inventory out of a desperate need to feel useful. He thought I skipped social events and expensive vacations because I simply could not afford them. He and my sister Jessica mocked my frugal habits relentlessly. They would laugh over expensive dinners, loudly pitying my boring, pathetic existence, completely unaware that my perceived poverty was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. I let them believe I was weak. I let them believe I was financially trapped. I swallowed their daily insults, their mocking laughter, and their endless condescension without saying a single word in my defense. But the truth, the absolute undeniable reality of who I actually was, would have brought my arrogant father straight to his knees. While my father was recklessly driving his company into the ground with terrible investments, and while Jessica was secretly drowning in massive offshore gambling debts, I was quietly building an empire in the dark. 4 years ago, Working late into the night in my tiny, unheated bedroom, I began developing a highly complex proprietary artificial intelligence auditing algorithm. I saw a massive gap in the corporate financial sector. Traditional auditing was incredibly slow, heavily prone to human error, and easily manipulated by corrupt executives like my father. I spent thousands of hours writing code testing financial models and refining a program that could instantly scan decades of corporate ledgers and detect even the most deeply buried anomalies, fraud and embezzlement. It was a groundbreaking piece of financial technology. I did not tell a single soul in my family about my work. I knew exactly what they would do. Richard would have immediately demanded ownership, claiming I developed it under his roof, and Jessica would have demanded I sell it immediately to fund her lavish lifestyle. So I kept my mouth shut. I quietly pitched my algorithm to major tech investors under a strict non-disclosure agreement. The response was explosive. 18 months ago, a massive global financial firm bought the exclusive rights to my software. The buyout was monumental. It netted me tens of millions of dollars in pure untraceable liquid cash. I remembered the exact moment the final wire transfer hit my private offshore accounts. I was sitting at the worn kitchen table in Seattle, eating a cheap bowl of soup, while my father yelled at me for forgetting to buy his expensive brand of coffee. I looked down at my phone under the table, staring at an account balance with more zeros than my father had ever seen in his entire life. And I simply nodded and apologized for the coffee. I was a multi-millionaire, secretly living in the shadow of a man who thought I was completely worthless. I quietly bought a breathtaking $40 million oceanfront mansion in Hawaii, purchasing it entirely in cash through an anonymous shell corporation to ensure my family could never find a single paper trail. I hired a private wealth manager, invested heavily in secure portfolios, and secured my future for the next 10 lifetimes. Yet despite having the financial power to walk away and buy my own island, I stayed in that toxic house. I continued to drive my beat-up car. I continued to let them treat me like human garbage. The obvious question was why? Why would a secret multimillionaire subject herself to such daily crushing emotional abuse? The answer to that question was the heaviest burden I have ever carried in my life. It was a promise I made to my mother, a promise that bound me to them long after she was gone. My mother was the only person in that house who ever showed me a fraction of genuine kindness, though she was always too weak to stand up to my father overbearing cruelty. 7 years ago, she was diagnosed with aggressive late-stage pancreatic cancer. The decline was brutal and incredibly fast. During her final week in the hospice ward, the sterile smell of the hospital room masking the inevitable reality of her death, she asked my father and sister to leave the room. She reached out with a thin, trembling hand and gripped my fingers with a desperate, terrifying strength. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes wide with a deep, lingering fear for the family she was leaving behind. She knew exactly who her husband and her eldest daughter really were. She knew their greed, their recklessness, and their profound inability to survive without someone cleaning up their messes. She looked at me, tears streaming down her pale cheeks, and she begged me to protect them. She made me swear on her life that I would look after Richard and Jessica. She made me promise that I would never abandon them, that I would keep the family business afloat, and that I would swallow my pride to keep our family together. I was young, terrified of losing her, and completely shattered by grief. I squeezed her fragile hand and gave her my absolute unbreakable word. I honored that painful deathbed promise for 7 agonizing years. That promise was the invisible chain around my neck. It was the only reason I stayed when every instinct screamed at me to leave. I absorbed my father's endless verbal abuse because I promised my dying mother I would protect him. I cleaned up Jessica, massive financial disasters, quietly fixing her mistakes and covering her tracks, because I promised my mother I would keep the family intact. I hid my immense wealth, played the role of the pathetic, subservient auditor, and completely sacrificed my own happiness, all to honor the final desperate wish of a dying woman. I let them break my heart day after day, year after year, because I thought enduring their cruelty was the ultimate expression of my love for her. I believed that breaking that promise would somehow tarnish her memory. So I stayed. I stayed while they belittled my career. I stayed while they took credit for my tireless work. I stayed while they balked my clothes and my quiet lifestyle. I endured it all completely, suffocating under the weight of my own loyalty. But loyalty only extends to those who do not actively try to destroy you. As I sat in the luxurious leather seat of the airplane, watching the moonlit clouds drift by, I realized with absolute crystal clear certainty that my promise to my mother was officially dead. I did not break it. They did. My father throwing my suitcase onto the wet concrete, accusing me of a massive felony I did not commit, and screaming at me to get out and stay out, was the exact moment the invisible chain completely shattered. By maliciously framing me for their own profound financial crimes, by planning to use me as a disposable scapegoat for the federal authorities, they had permanently severed the sacred bond of family. They had violently rejected my protection. They had intentionally thrown me to the wolves to save themselves. And in doing so, they had unwittingly set me completely free. I was no longer morally or emotionally obligated to save them from their own catastrophic, greedy mistakes. I did not owe them another ounce of my time, my energy, or my secret fortune. I took another sip of my sparkling water, relishing the crisp, clean taste. I thought about the towering iron gates of my massive Hawaiian estate, the breathtaking infinity pool overlooking the crashing waves, the private staff waiting for my arrival, and the absolute peace of a life completely devoid of their toxic presence. I was flying toward a paradise they could not even begin to fathom. Funded by a brilliant mind, they had relentlessly called stupid. They thought they had brilliantly outsmarted a naive, helpless girl. They thought they had successfully executed the perfect crime by leaving me out in the cold rain to take the fall for their stolen $200,000. They had no idea that I was already miles above them untouchable. Wealthy beyond their wildest, most greedy comprehension, and holding all the evidence needed to ensure they faced the devastating total destruction they so richly deserved. I closed my eyes, a genuine, powerful smile finally breaking across my face. The flight attendant walked by softly asking if I needed anything else to make my journey more comfortable. I politely shook my head, thanking her with a quiet confidence I had never been allowed to show before. I had absolutely everything I needed. The storm was far behind me and karma was just beginning to brew. The flight attendant gently cleared my empty crystal glass, leaving me completely alone in the dim amber light of the first-class cabin. I reached down into my premium leather carry-on bag and pulled out my sleek silver laptop. The cool metal felt instantly grounding against my warm, trembling palms. I opened the screen, the sudden sharp brightness illuminating my face in the quiet darkness of the night flight. I did not open my personal email. I did not check my massive offshore investment portfolios or review the incoming royalties from my software patents. I bypassed all of that luxury and immediately opened a highly encrypted private cloud server. 3 days ago, my entire life was still a desperate, exhausting cycle of seeking basic human approval from people who fundamentally despised my existence. 3 days ago, I was sitting at my cramped, poorly lit desk in the damp corner of my father's failing logistics company, meticulously running the end-of-quarter financial reports. As a senior corporate auditor, my entire world is built exclusively on patterns, logic, and undeniable mathematics. Numbers tell a very specific, detailed story, and they never ever lie. During my routine checks, I had noticed a highly suspicious, deeply buried series of discrepancies in the primary vendor payout ledgers. These were not simple accounting errors. They were small, deliberate, incremental transfers deliberately routed through obscure, newly created subsidiary accounts that eventually pooled into massive, entirely unauthorized withdrawals. Exactly $200,000 was completely missing from the operating budget. The digital obfuscation was incredibly clever, completely invisible to an untrained eye, but I was not untrained. I had spent 4 years building a multi-million-dollar artificial intelligence software explicitly designed to catch exactly this kind of phantom financial activity. My stomach had plummeted into a freezing, bottomless abyss when I used a backdoor protocol to trace the internal network login paths. The fraudulent transfers originated directly from my father's private, strictly off-limits home office. I violently refused to believe it at first. The pathetic, hopelessly loyal daughter inside me desperately wanted to believe that the company network had simply been hacked by an outside entity. But the cold, calculating, highly trained auditor inside me knew the absolute undeniable truth. That is exactly why 3 days ago, While my father was out playing a long game of golf and my sister Jessica was getting an extravagant $200 spa manicure, I quietly slipped into his locked study. My hands were shaking as I installed a microscopic voice-activated hidden camera directly inside the spine of a thick, hollowed-out legal dictionary on his top bookshelf, angling the tiny lens straight down at his heavy mahogany desk. I needed absolute, undeniable proof. I needed to finally know the unvarnished truth about my own family. Now soaring 30,000 feet above the dark, churning Pacific Ocean, my finger hovered nervously over the laptop trackpad. The secure server synced automatically, and a grid of encrypted video thumbnails rapidly populated my screen. I clicked the most recent, largest file recorded just mere hours before the violent, screaming confrontation on the porch. The video player buffered for a fraction of a second before the image sharpened into terrifying high-definition clarity. The audio hissed softly in my ears, picking up the unmistakable, deeply familiar, ambient sounds of my childhood home. I plugged in my expensive noise-canceling earphones, pressing them deeply into my ears because I needed to hear every single devastating syllable they had spoken. The crisp footage showed my father Richard sitting heavily in his oversized leather executive chair. He was pouring a very generous, careless measure of expensive aged scotch into a heavy crystal glass. The ice clinked sharply against the sides, a sound that sent an involuntary, sickening shiver straight down my spine. The heavy oak door of the study swung open rapidly, and my older sister, Jessica, glided into the video frame. She was wearing the exact same pristine white cashmere sweater she had on during my brutal eviction. She closed the door firmly behind her, checked the hallway, and locked it with a loud metallic click. The casual relaxed. Almost a celebratory posture of the two people on my screen made my breath catch painfully in my throat. There was absolutely no panic in the room. There was no frantic fear of missing company funds. There was only the comfortable, deeply disturbing, sickening intimacy of two arrogant co-conspirators who firmly believed they had completely gotten away with a massive life-destroying crime. I watched my illuminated screen completely paralyzed by dread as Jessica walked confidently over to the desk and dropped a thick stack of company transfer documents right in front of my father. These were the exact same ledgers he would hurl aggressively at my chest just a few hours later. "Is it finally done?" Jessica asked, her voice dripping with an arrogant, careless boredom that made my blood run cold. She picked up a heavy silver pen from the desk and spun it absent-mindedly between her perfectly manicured fingers. My father took a slow, highly satisfied sip of his scotch, letting the amber liquid warm his throat before he nodded slowly. He slid the documents back toward her across the polished wood. "Everything is perfectly routed," he said, a sickeningly proud, deeply sinister smirk spreading across his face. "The $200,000 is completely clean. It bounced through the 3 dummy vendors just like you suggested. The offshore accounts are fully loaded, the transfers are verified, and your massive debt is officially wiped clean." I stared blindly at the screen, my heart pounding so hard and fast I could hear it ringing loudly in my ears. Jessica's offshore debt. I had always known my sister loved extravagantly expensive things, but I had absolutely no idea she was drowning in highly illegal gambling debts. She was a reckless, out-of-control monster hiding behind designer clothes and a perfectly curated social media smile. "Thank God." Jessica sighed dramatically, collapsing heavily into the plush guest chair opposite the desk. Those dangerous offshore bookies were actively threatening to contact Marcus by the end of the week. If Marcus ever found out I lost 200 grand, betting blindly on international sports syndicates, he would file for divorce in a heartbeat. He's way too obsessed with his pristine, perfect real estate reputation and his community standing to stay married to a massive financial liability like me. She laughed, then a sharp, cruel tinkling sound that made me physically nauseous. She did not care about the massive catastrophic risk she had brought upon the family business. She only cared about protecting her own comfortable, luxurious, heavily funded lifestyle and maintaining her wealthy husband's blind adoration. My father leaned forward over the desk, looking at his golden spoiled child with absolute unshakable blind devotion. "I would never let that happen to you. Jessie." He promised, his tone thick with a sickeningly sweet paternal affection he had never ever bothered to use with me in my entire life. "You are the shining star of this family. You have a vital image to maintain in this city. I took care of it. But now we have to take care of the very dangerous loose ends." He tapped the stack of papers emphatically. "Sign them." Jessica leaned eagerly over the mahogany desk. I zoomed in tightly on the video feed, my hands trembling violently against the smooth keyboard. I watched in absolute unadulterated horror as my own sister carefully gripped the silver pen, stared intently at a sample of my handwriting on a yellow sticky note, and flawlessly forged my signature onto the bottom of the fraudulent transfer authorizations. She forged my name perfectly stroke for stroke. She was cheerfully signing my death warrant with a bright, beautiful smile on her face. "Her signature is so basic," Jessica mocked loudly, tossing the silver pen dismissively back onto the desk. "Just exactly like her. Boring, predictable, and totally easy to duplicate." My father chuckled warmly, gathering the freshly forged documents and tapping them deliberately into a neat uniform stack. But the easy laughter died quickly, replaced rapidly by a dark, incredibly sinister seriousness that chilled the blood in my veins. "The federal IRS sent the formal certified notification this morning," he said, his voice dropping to a low, deeply conspiratorial whisper. "The massive federal audit begins in exactly 2 weeks. They are bringing a ruthless team of forensic accountants to aggressively tear through the last 5 years of our logistics operations. They will absolutely find the missing $200,000. There is zero chance they miss a discrepancy of that massive magnitude." Jessica did not panic at this terrifying news. She simply crossed her legs elegantly, swirling the remaining scotch in her father's glass with absolute confidence. "And the digital trail?" she asked casually. "It points directly, undeniably, to Maya's computer terminal." My father confirmed, leaning back in his chair with a look of pure evil satisfaction. "I used her specific login credentials last night when she was asleep. The internal IP logs the forged signatures. The specific routing authorizations. Every single piece of hard, tangible evidence paints a perfect, undeniable picture of a disgruntled, overworked, deeply bitter auditor intentionally stealing from her own family." My lungs instantly stopped working. The recycled air in the first-class cabin suddenly felt incredibly thin and suffocating. I was watching my biological father actively, intentionally plot my total, irrevocable destruction. He was not just stealing money to save his favorite daughter, he was deliberately framing me for a massive life-ruining federal crime. "So what is the exact plan for tonight?" Jessica asked, her eyes gleaming with wicked, impatient anticipation. "We need to make it incredibly convincing for Marcus. He is starting to ask way too many questions about the company finances lately. If he sees me defending Maya or acting too calm, he might get incredibly suspicious." My father slammed his fist loudly onto the desk. Emails, aggressively rehearsing the exact violent rage he would unleash on the wet porch later that evening. "We throw her out," he stated coldly, his eyes dead ruthless and entirely devoid of human empathy. "Tonight, the second she gets home from work, I am going to aggressively confront her in the hallway. I will scream at the top of my lungs. I will forcefully throw the altered ledgers at her chest. I will make a massive, unforgettable scene so Marcus sees exactly how angry, shocked, and deeply betrayed we are by her horrific actions. We have to establish the protective narrative immediately. Maya is a thief. Maya violently betrayed the family. We kicked her out into the street in a fit of pure righteous fury." Jessica smiled broadly, a terrifying, venomous expression that made her look like a genuine cold-blooded predator. "And when the federal IRS investigators eventually show up at the door?" she asked softly. "We immediately hand over the forged documents," my father replied, without a single ounce of hesitation or guilt. "We tell them our heartbroken, devastated family discovered the terrible theft just weeks before the audit. We play the shocked, grieving victims perfectly. Maya has absolutely no money for a decent corporate defense attorney. She makes 45 grand a year and lives paycheck to paycheck. When the ruthless federal prosecutors threaten her with 30 years in a maximum security prison, she will have absolutely no choice but to take a terrible plea deal. She will legally take the fall, she will go straight to federal prison, and we will walk away completely clean and totally blameless." I slammed the laptop shut with the violent shaking force. The loud, sharp crack echoed slightly in the quiet sleeping cabin, drawing a brief concerned glance from the flight attendant, passing the curtain, but I could not bring myself to care. My entire body was vibrating violently with an incredibly intense, electrifying, terrifying energy. 30 years in federal prison. My own flesh and blood father and my only sister had sat in their comfortable, expensive home, casually drinking aged scotch, and meticulously plotted to lock me inside a tiny concrete cell for the rest of my natural breathing life. They knew exactly what a federal grand jury indictment would do to me. They knew with absolute certainty it would completely destroy my professional reputation, permanently strip me of my physical freedom, and completely annihilate any future I could ever possibly hope to have. And they did not care. They actually laughed about it. They thought my handwriting was basic. They thought my entire existence was completely, utterly expendable. For 7 long, agonizing, suffocating years, I had clung desperately to the fragile, heartbreaking promise I made to my dying mother. I had completely sacrificed my fleeting youth, deeply buried my immense secret wealth, and silently endured their daily crushing psychological torture just to keep this pathetic family safe from their own catastrophic, greedy stupidity. I had firmly, foolishly believed that beneath their profound cruelty, there was some deeply buried fundamental familial bond that prevented them from truly crossing the line into absolute irredeemable evil. I was a colossal fool. That sacred deathbed promise was completely, unequivocally shattered into microscopic pieces, instantly and permanently vaporized by the sheer staggering, monumental magnitude of their betrayal. My mother had tearfully asked me to protect them, but she had fundamentally, tragically failed to protect me from the very monsters she had left me alone with in that house. The expected tears did not come. The deep sorrow I fully expected to feel, the familiar, pathetic, heavy grief of being the perpetually unloved, unwanted daughter never materialized in my chest. Instead, the icy, terrifying calm that had settled over me on the wet porch rapidly crystallized into something infinitely more dangerous. It transformed instantly into pure, unadulterated, highly weaponized rage. It was a cold, calculating, beautifully terrifying anger that sharpened every single one of my senses to a razor's edge. They wanted to play a high-stakes, deadly game of federal fraud. They wanted to ruthlessly manipulate the justice system, forge legal documents, and use me as their personal, disposable, sacrificial lamb. They had absolutely no idea that they had just picked a fatal fight with a woman who understood complex financial systems better than anyone on the entire planet. They had no idea they had just deeply provoked a secret, highly connected multimillionaire who literally owned the very ground they walked on. I leaned my heavy head back against the plush leather headrest and stared intently at the dark, curving ceiling of the plane. I was not just going to weakly defend myself against their pathetic, sloppy IRS frame-up. I was going to systematically, surgically, and completely annihilate every single aspect of their miserable lives. I was going to violently tear down their fake, crumbling empire, expose their vile, disgusting crimes to the entire world, and watch them desperately beg for the very mercy they had violently, cheerfully denied me. The quiet, defensive auditor was dead. The counterattack had officially begun. The heavy wheels of the private jet touched down smoothly on the secluded Maui tarmac, just as the first brilliant streaks of vibrant orange dawn began to violently paint the horizon. I walked slowly down the padded steps of the aircraft, and the immediate physical shift was incredibly deeply jarring. Just 9 hours ago, I was violently shivering on a cracked, muddy concrete porch in Seattle, completely soaked to the very bone by a freezing, relentless rainstorm. Now, the thick air wrapping around my tired body was profoundly warm and incredibly rich, thick with the sweet, intoxicating scent of blooming plumeria and the fresh, salty mist of the vast Pacific Ocean. It felt exactly like stepping out of a dark, suffocating freezer and walking directly into a soft, welcoming embrace. The lingering physical tension that had been permanently deeply knotted in my neck and shoulders for my entire adult life simply began to instantly melt away under the gentle, golden Hawaiian sun. I stood perfectly still on the quiet runway and took a deep, grounding breath, pulling the clean, tropical air deeply into my aching lungs. For the very first time in 29 exhausting years, I did not feel the heavy, crushing weight of my father and his endless cruel demands, or my sister and her incredibly toxic expectations pressing painfully down on my chest. I was completely, utterly alone in this warm paradise, and it was the most magnificent, liberating feeling in the entire world. Waiting patiently for me at the absolute edge of the pristine private tarmac was a massive, sleek, matte black armored SUV. The heavy, dark-tinted windows made the commanding vehicle look exactly like an impenetrable rolling fortress resting quietly against the vibrant green tropical landscape. My newly appointed private security detail, a tall, incredibly broad-shouldered professional man named David, stepped forward immediately and opened the heavy, reinforced passenger door for me, with a deep, respectful nod. He did not ask me a single question about where I had been. He did not demand absolutely anything from me. He simply treated me with the absolute quiet, respectful dignity that a true, highly trained professional reserves strictly for their employer. I slid gracefully into the expansive, cavernous backseat, sinking deeply into the buttery, soft, hand-stitched cream leather. The heavy armored door closed firmly behind me with a solid, deeply satisfying thud that instantly and completely muted the outside world. As we pulled smoothly away from the small airport and merged seamlessly onto the winding coastal highway, I leaned my head back and simply stared out the dark-tinted glass at the crashing, white-capped turquoise waves. The absolute staggering contrast between my two completely separate lives was almost too extreme to properly logically articulate. In rainy Seattle, I drove a pathetic 10-year-old rusted sedan with a failing transmission, constantly terrified of accidentally parking it in the wrong spot and invoking my sister and her explosive, unhinged wrath. I lived my entire daily existence in constant, agonizing fear of saying the wrong word, speaking at the wrong volume, or making the wrong facial expression. But here, sitting quietly in the soundproof, climate-controlled cabin of a luxury vehicle built specifically to withstand a literal war zone, I was an absolute untouchable phantom. I watched the lush emerald green mountains roll by, reflecting deeply on the sheer pathetic irony of my biological family and their current daily situation. Right at this very exact moment, Richard and Jessica were probably waking up in their comfortable suburban home, smugly congratulating themselves over their morning coffee on a perfectly brilliantly executed eviction. They honestly, truly believed I was desperately wandering the cold, dangerous Seattle streets, weeping uncontrollably over my ruined cheap suitcase and begging for loose change. They had absolutely no earthly idea that I was currently being comfortably chauffeured along the most breathtakingly beautiful coastline on planet Earth, heading rapidly toward an absolute sanctuary they could not even afford to dream about in their wildest, greediest fantasies. After 45 minutes of incredibly smooth driving, the heavy SUV turned sharply off the main coastal highway and began a steep, winding ascent up a private, heavily forested mountain road. The lush, thick tropical canopy closed in tightly around the vehicle, offering absolute perfect total seclusion from the rest of humanity. We rounded a final sharp scenic bend and slowly approached a towering, highly imposing set of solid black iron security gates set deeply into a thick volcanic stone wall. David reached forward and pressed a single button on the secure center console, and the massive iron gates swung open completely silently and seamlessly, welcoming me into my own absolute private kingdom. The incredibly long, sweeping paver driveway was lined meticulously with towering ancient royal palm trees, leading directly to the grand front entrance of my massive $40 million estate. When the heavy SUV finally rolled to a gentle, perfect stop, I stepped out onto the pristine stone courtyard and simply stood there, completely, utterly breathless. The staggering architectural masterpiece standing proudly in front of me was a stunning, flawless blend of dark, rich mahogany, smooth, cool gray slate, and endless soaring walls of pristine floor-to-ceiling glass. The entire back portion of the massive luxury house was completely, utterly open to the tropical elements, leading smoothly out to a sprawling, shimmering infinity pool that seemed to drop off directly into the vast, endless blue expanse of the beautiful Pacific Ocean. There were absolutely no loud, irritating neighbors anywhere in sight. There was zero screeching, awful city traffic to be heard. There was only the deep, rhythmic, soothing sound of the massive ocean waves crashing violently and beautifully against the sharp, black volcanic cliffs hundreds of feet directly below my feet. I walked slowly, silently through the towering grand entrance, trailing my shaking hand gently along the cool, smooth stone interior walls. The sheer, staggering, monumental scale of the place was simply magnificent. I had purchased this incredible, sprawling property completely anonymously over a full year ago, using a heavily shielded, highly complex corporate trust, but I had actually never allowed myself to visit it in person. I had been far too terrified that leaving rainy Seattle for even a single brief week would inevitably trigger a catastrophic total meltdown in my family failing logistics business. I had willingly, deliberately deprived myself of experiencing this absolute gorgeous paradise just to carefully balance the miserable daily ledgers of a cruel father who actively, deeply despised me. I walked with slow, measured steps straight through the massive open concept main living room and ascended the gorgeous floating glass staircase leading up to the primary master suite. The main bedroom was incredibly expansive, vastly larger than the entire first floor of the cramped, suffocating house I had painfully grown up in. I walked directly into the exact center of the expansive sunlit room and stopped completely dead in front of a massive, gilded floor-to-ceiling mirror. I stared highly critically at the quiet reflection staring back at me. I looked like a complete, absolute, pathetic disaster. I was actually still wearing the exact same cheap synthetic beige trousers and the incredibly shapeless faded navy blue blouse I had worn to the miserable auditing office early yesterday morning. The extremely cheap, thin fabric was hopelessly severely wrinkled, completely ruined and stained by the freezing mud and dirty splashing rainwater from my father's cold, wet porch. My dark hair was an awful, tangled, messy, wet knot, and my face was deeply drawn, intensely pale, and completely hollowed out from years of chronic, agonizing daily exhaustion. I looked exactly perfectly like the pathetic, weak, subservient little corporate victim Richard and Jessica deeply, desperately needed me to be. With incredibly slow, deliberate, highly intentional movements, I reached my hands up and unbuttoned the cheap, stained navy blouse, letting it slip off my shoulders and fall completely to the pristine floor. I quickly stepped out of the ruined, dirty beige trousers, kicking them far away with a profound, intense feeling of absolute, total disgust. I systematically stripped off every single suffocating piece of that miserable, pathetic Seattle auditing uniform and left it lying in a dirty, discarded heap on the pristine, glowing bamboo floor. I walked silently into the massive gray marble master bathroom and stepped directly under the incredibly powerful rain shower, turning the heavy handle until the water was blistering hot. I stood there for a very long time, simply letting the scalding hot, rushing water completely wash away the last remaining bitter traces of the freezing, toxic Seattle storm. I vigorously, aggressively scrubbed my skin until it was flushed fiercely pink, purposefully, violently washing away the deeply ingrained, awful toxic residue of their endless daily emotional and psychological abuse. When I finally confidently stepped out of the thick, steam-filled shower, I did not even glance back at my cheap, ruined auditor clothes. Instead, I walked with incredible purpose directly into the expansive, custom-designed walk-in closet that my private luxury styling team had completely thoroughly stocked weeks in advance. I completely bypassed the casual everyday wear and reached up to pull down a stunning, perfectly tailored, emerald green silk dress that felt incredibly heavy and incredibly luxurious as it draped perfectly across my clean skin. I easily slipped my feet into a pair of highly expensive designer heels that immediately clicked sharply and authoritatively against the smooth, shiny hardwood floor. I brushed my damp, dark hair with strong, sweeping strokes until it fell perfectly in sleek, heavy, elegant waves straight down my back. I confidently walked back out into the bright master suite and stepped boldly out onto the expansive private glass balcony overlooking the steep, sheer volcanic cliff. The warm, incredibly powerful ocean wind immediately caught the heavy green silk of my dress, whipping it fiercely and beautifully around my strong legs. I stood tall at the absolute edge of the world, looking out at the endless bright blue horizon, breathing deeply in the undeniable, intoxicating scent of absolute, ultimate, untouchable power. The timid, utterly frightened little girl who had cried pathetically on that wet, cold concrete porch was completely, absolutely, permanently dead. I was Maya Sterling, an incredibly brilliant, utterly untouchable multimillionaire, and I was finally, fully, completely ready to burn their incredibly fake, crumbling, miserable empire straight down to the absolute ground. The morning sun was pouring through the massive glass walls of my private library when Julian finally arrived. Julian was not just a lawyer. He was a highly specialized asset protection attorney who catered exclusively to the ultra-wealthy. He was dressed in a sharp navy suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase, and he walked with the quiet, confident authority of a man who spent his entire career completely destroying corporate criminals. I had called him on his secure personal line the exact moment I landed in Maui and instructed him to catch the very next flight from the mainland. He had cancelled his entire week of high-profile meetings without a single question because he knew exactly who I was and he knew how much power my portfolio wielded. I was sitting at the head of a massive solid mahogany conference table overlooking the crashing ocean holding a cup of hot black coffee. My laptop was open in front of me, displaying the deeply encrypted files I had successfully pulled from my father's dark network. Julian took the seat directly across from me and opened his briefcase. He did not offer any meaningless small talk. He simply pulled out a legal pad and asked me what kind of war we were starting today. I turned my laptop screen toward him and hit play on the hidden camera footage. The crisp, clear audio of my father and my sister laughing about my impending federal prison sentence echoed sharply across the quiet, luxurious library. I watched Julian closely as he viewed the video. He was a man who had seen every possible variation of corporate greed and human betrayal. But even his stoic professional face hardened into a mask of pure, cold disgust. He watched my sister Jessica expertly forge my signature on the massive transfer authorizations. He listened to my father Richard explicitly detail how he used my secure internal login credentials to completely frame me for the stolen $200,000. When the video finally ended, Julian slowly took off his glasses and let out a long, heavy breath. He looked at me with a profound, deeply respectful understanding of exactly what I had just survived. He asked me to show him the actual financial ledgers and the digital routing logs. For the next 2 hours, we sat together in absolute silence, meticulously tearing through every single line of my father's pathetic, sloppy financial crimes. The evidence was incredibly overwhelming and mathematically undeniable. We traced the exact path of the stolen funds from the primary company operating account directly through 3 fake subsidiary vendors that Jessica had hastily set up. We completely verified the final destination of the money, which was a highly questionable offshore gambling syndicate. I showed Julian the precise internal server logs proving exactly what time my father had used my login credentials while I was fast asleep in my bedroom. The digital breadcrumbs were so incredibly obvious and poorly hidden that Julian actually let out a short, bitter laugh. They were not brilliant criminal masterminds. They were just arrogant, deeply greedy fools who firmly believed they could simply throw their quiet auditor daughter under the bus and walk away completely clean. Julian leaned back in his leather chair and began laying out our legal strategy. He told me we could immediately file a massive civil lawsuit against Richard and Jessica for extreme defamation and financial fraud. He said we could send a highly aggressive formal warning letter from his prestigious firm demanding they instantly confess to the theft and completely clear my name. He confidently promised me that the mere sight of his official letterhead would completely terrify them into absolute submission. He assured me we could have all of their personal assets legally frozen by the end of the business day. I sat perfectly still, listening to his brilliant standard legal advice, and I felt an icy, dangerous calm settle deeply into my bones. I looked at Julian and calmly shook my head. I told him we were not sending a single warning letter. We were not filing a standard civil lawsuit. We were not going to give them the profound luxury of a polite legal heads-up. I explained to Julian that sending a warning would simply give them precious time to panic, time to hire their own expensive defense attorneys, and time to potentially destroy crucial physical evidence back in Seattle. More importantly, it would give them the false hope that this was just a simple family dispute that could somehow be resolved with fake tears and pathetic, empty apologies. I did not want apologies. I wanted absolute total devastation. I wanted the exact same level of ruthless destruction they had so cheerfully planned for me. They had literally plotted to send me to a federal penitentiary for 30 years without a single ounce of hesitation or human guilt. They had thrown me out into a freezing rainstorm like I was nothing but disposable trash. A polite legal warning was completely out of the question. We were going straight for the jugular. Julian watched my face for a long silent moment, completely understanding the dark, profound depth of my absolute resolve. He slowly nodded and asked me exactly how I wanted to proceed. I turned the laptop back toward me and opened a highly secure encrypted file sharing portal. I told Julian that we were going to bypass the local civil courts entirely. We were going to hand-deliver my father and my sister directly to the most terrifying, relentless financial predators on the planet. The United States federal government. The Internal Revenue Service was already deeply suspicious of my father's logistics company, which was exactly why the massive audit was scheduled for next week. If we anonymously fed the federal investigators the absolute undeniable truth right now, they would not just conduct a routine corporate audit, they would launch a full-scale catastrophic criminal investigation. I carefully selected the raw, unedited, high-definition video file from the hidden camera. I attached the original, unaltered banking ledgers, clearly showing the massive offshore transfers. I attached the complete digital server logs that definitively proved my father had maliciously spoofed my internet protocol address to frame me. I bundled every single piece of damning, irrefutable evidence into one massive, highly encrypted digital package. Julian leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the mahogany table. He warned me that once I pushed this specific button, there was absolutely no turning back. He explained that the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the Federal Bureau of Investigation do not simply send warning letters. They do not politely ask for meetings. They execute sudden, violent, early morning raids. They completely seize all corporate and personal assets without warning. They absolutely destroy lives, and they aggressively pursue massive felony convictions with terrifying zero mercy. He looked me dead in the eye and asked me if I was fully prepared to watch my biological father and my only sister be dragged out of their comfortable, affluent home in federal handcuffs. He asked me if I was truly ready to permanently, completely annihilate my own family. I did not even blink. I told him they had stopped being my family the exact moment they decided my life was completely expendable. I told him they had dug their own graves with their incredible toxic greed and their staggering monumental arrogance. I was simply handing the federal authorities the shovels. I asked Julian to provide the direct secure reporting addresses for the lead investigators at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the Regional White-Collar Crime Unit of the FBI. Julian quickly typed the secure federal contact details onto a notepad and slid it across the table to me. I carefully manually entered the addresses into the secure encrypted portal. My hands did not shake even a fraction of an inch. My breathing was perfectly, remarkably steady. I double-checked every single attached file, ensuring the narrative of their guilt was absolutely flawless and completely undeniable. The digital package was a perfect, lethal missile aimed directly at the very heart of their fake, crumbling empire. I hovered my cursor right over the bright blue send button on the screen. For one tiny, brief, fleeting fraction of a second, the ghost of the pathetic, desperate little girl I used to be flashed vividly in my mind. The girl who just desperately wanted her father to be proud of her. The girl who just wanted her older sister to actually love her. But that weak, pathetic ghost was instantly, permanently vaporized by the vivid, burning memory of my father. Hateful face screaming at me on the freezing wet porch. The memory of Jessica, wicked, triumphant smirk as she locked the heavy door and left me alone in the dark storm, completely sealed my absolute resolve. I pressed down firmly on the trackpad. The mouse clicked softly in the quiet library. The progress bar flashed brightly across the screen, filling rapidly with green light as the massive digital payload transmitted securely across the encrypted network. In less than 5 seconds, the screen flashed a single confirmation message, indicating the files had been successfully delivered directly to the federal authorities. It was done. The lethal button had been pushed. There was absolutely no reversing the transmission, no taking back the hard evidence, and no possible way for my father or my sister to ever escape the catastrophic federal hellfire that was currently speeding directly toward them. Julian let out a low, sharp whistle, leaning back deeply in his chair and running a hand through his dark hair. He looked at the confirmation screen and quietly stated that my family had absolutely no earthly idea what kind of biblical apocalypse was about to violently crash down on their heads. I closed the silver laptop with a solid, satisfying snap and reached for my coffee cup. The dark liquid was still perfectly warm. I took a slow, deep sip, looking out through the massive glass windows at the beautiful, bright blue Hawaiian ocean. I felt an incredible, profound physical lightness spreading rapidly through my entire chest. It felt exactly like stepping out of a suffocating dark cage and breathing pure, clean oxygen for the very first time in my entire miserable life. The agonizing heavy burden of my toxic family was completely permanently lifted from my shoulders. I knew exactly what would happen next. I knew the incredibly sharp, relentless federal investigators would open that anonymous file package within the hour. I knew they would immediately verify the hidden camera footage and instantly match the massive fraudulent transfers to the offshore gambling syndicates. I knew they would quickly, rapidly secure emergency federal warrants from a judge before the day was even over. Right now, back in rainy, cold Seattle, Richard and Jessica were probably still completely, utterly oblivious. They were likely sitting comfortably in their warm, dry house, completely arrogant and absolutely certain that they had perfectly successfully ruined my life to save their own. They genuinely believed I was the weak, pathetic loser who would quietly take their abuse and silently accept their horrific false criminal charges. They did not know that a massive, unstoppable ticking time bomb had just been placed directly under their comfortable, affluent lives. I set my coffee cup down on the table and smiled genuinely at Julian. The defensive strategy was completely officially over. We were going to sit back in absolute tropical luxury and watch their entire fake toxic world burn beautifully, completely to the ground. While I was peacefully adjusting to the rhythmic sound of the Hawaiian waves, completely safely insulated in my multi-million-dollar sanctuary, an absolute Category 5 hurricane was violently tearing through Seattle. Exactly 48 hours after my father aggressively threw my cheap suitcase onto that freezing wet concrete porch, a fleet of unmarked dark federal vehicles abruptly swarmed the main parking lot of his struggling logistics company. Over 24 highly armed federal agents from the Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division, and the Regional White-Collar Crime Unit of the FBI aggressively simultaneously breached every single entrance of the corporate building. They did not knock politely. They did not ask for a friendly meeting with management. They stormed the quiet corporate offices with terrifying, immediate authority. They aggressively ordered every single terrified employee to immediately step away from their computers, leaving all active screens visibly running. They methodically, violently seized every single corporate hard drive, every physical filing cabinet, and every scrap of financial documentation they could legally firmly lay their hands on. The sheer massive scale of the sudden coordinated raid was specifically designed to ensure absolutely no physical evidence could possibly be destroyed. It was exactly precisely the kind of devastating, relentless, overwhelming federal response I had intentionally, carefully triggered from thousands of miles away. Richard and Jessica were completely, totally, utterly blindsided. According to the deeply satisfying, frantic voicemails they unknowingly left on an old burner phone I had deliberately tossed in a dumpster at the airport, they were absolutely, totally convinced this was just a minor, routine, random audit. They firmly, confidently believed they could simply calmly hand the aggressive federal agents the forged ledgers pointing to my old company computer terminal and happily, quickly wash their hands of the entire messy situation. They arrogantly, stupidly assumed the highly trained investigators would just take one quick, lazy look at the fabricated evidence, magically believe their pathetic, shallow lies, and immediately issue a massive federal arrest warrant for their supposedly runaway auditor daughter. They had absolutely no earthly idea that the very agents completely tearing apart their corporate offices already securely possessed the raw, unedited, high-definition hidden camera footage of Jessica cheerfully, perfectly forging my complex signature, while Richard casually, happily drank his expensive, aged scotch. The federal authorities knew exactly precisely who the real, actual criminals were before they ever even stepped a single foot inside the heavily compromised building. The immediate catastrophic fallout was spectacularly, devastatingly swift and utterly, brutally public. The aggressive federal raid made the early evening local news instantly severely damaging Richard, carefully cultivated but entirely fake reputation as a prominent, honest local businessman. But the absolute true explosive collateral damage of their incredible, disgusting greed, did not hit the Sterling family until early the very next morning. Marcus, the highly successful razor-sharp real estate broker who had looked at me with such profound misplaced deep disgust on that freezing wet porch, walked confidently into his sleek downtown high-rise corporate office, expecting a completely normal, highly profitable Tuesday. He sat down at his massive custom-built mahogany desk, opened his expensive sleek silver laptop, and attempted to quickly casually initiate a massive standard $2 million wire transfer to close a highly lucrative commercial property deal he had been carefully negotiating for over 6 long months. The massive, highly important transaction was immediately, instantly, aggressively denied. A stark, terrifying red error message flashed brightly violently across his expensive monitor, explicitly stating that all of his personal and corporate bank accounts had been completely, absolutely, fully frozen by direct federal order pending a massive, highly sensitive criminal investigation. Marcus was a man who literally built his entire life, his entire massively successful identity on absolute, perfect, unshakable control. He had meticulously, painstakingly clawed his way up from absolutely nothing, working, grueling, endless double shifts to eventually build a highly respected multi-million-dollar commercial real estate empire. A frozen bank account was not just a massive, major professional inconvenience to him, it was a direct, terrifying, mortal threat to his very survival. He immediately frantically called his highly aggressive senior personal wealth manager, demanding an instant, completely clear explanation. He assumed it was just a massive, terrible clerical error, a stupid banking glitch. He was fundamentally, undeniably wrong. His frantic, worried wealth manager explained in a quiet, deeply terrified voice that Marcus' personal name, his highly valuable, immaculate social security number, and his pristine, perfect corporate tax identification number were deeply, fundamentally, aggressively intertwined with a massive, highly complex web of extremely illegal, highly questionable offshore loans. Loans that were currently the primary central focus of a massive, aggressive, multi-agency federal fraud investigation involving his father-in-law logistics company. Marcus felt the blood completely, totally drain instantly from his face, leaving him feeling violently sick to his stomach. He had never signed a single loan document for Richard's struggling company. He had actively, purposefully, completely kept his own highly successful, incredibly clean real estate empire, totally, rigidly, entirely separate from his father-in-law. Deeply messy, chaotic, failing logistics business. He immediately, frantically, violently drove straight to the central headquarters of his primary commercial bank, demanding to physically, loudly see every single shred of the alleged fraudulent documentation. What the terrified, sweating bank manager carefully, silently slid across the desk made Marcus physically stagger violently backward. There, printed clearly, undeniable, in black and white, were highly sophisticated, incredibly complex, multi-million-dollar loan guarantees, entirely securing Jessica, massive, completely hidden offshore gambling debts, using Marcus' clean, pristine, highly valuable personal assets as the primary collateral. And right at the very bottom of every single legally binding page was his own distinctive, powerful signature. Except he had absolutely, definitely never, ever signed them. His own wife, the beautiful, pampered golden child he completely, unconditionally loved and fiercely, ruthlessly protected, had perfectly, expertly forged his name to save her own skin, exactly the same way she had cheerfully, ruthlessly forged my name to frame me for the stolen $200,000. She had completely, intentionally, happily gambled away his hard-earned money, his perfect reputation, and his entire incredibly bright future without a single second of hesitation or human guilt. The profound, earth-shattering depth of Jessica, absolute, incredible, vile betrayal hit Marcus like a massive, speeding, runaway freight train. He had looked at me, the quiet, unassuming, completely loyal sister-in-law, with total, utter disgust, believing I was a selfish, vile thief. He had stood perfectly, solidly between us, physically protecting his beloved wife from my supposed toxic presence, completely, thoroughly, entirely unaware that the actual, real venomous snake was standing right beside him, wearing incredibly expensive cashmere and a fake, sweet, innocent smile. The staggering, monumentally devastating realization ignited a massive, burning, explosive, white-hot fury deep in his chest. Marcus did not just get incredibly angry, Marcus got dangerously, surgically, highly analytical. If Jessica and Richard were completely entirely willing to ruthlessly forge his signature to cover up massive catastrophic offshore debts, then the pathetic, totally absurd, incredibly shallow narrative they had confidently loudly spun about me, suddenly, rapidly, completely disintegrated into absolute total dust. He instantly, rapidly understood that I was never the real thief. I was simply the convenient, easy, highly disposable target, consumed entirely by a desperate, frantic, burning need for the absolute, complete, unvarnished truth. Marcus bypassed his expensive standard lawyers entirely and reached out directly, immediately, to a highly aggressive, highly discreet, private forensic investigator. He kept strictly on a very expensive permanent retainer for complex commercial property background checks. He ruthlessly, aggressively demanded that the investigator track every single digital breadcrumb of then missing $200,000 that Richard loudly, falsely claimed I had violently stolen. He needed to know exactly precisely where the money had actually gone, and exactly perfectly how Jessica and Richard had so smoothly, easily framed me. He firmly, fully expected the incredibly highly paid investigator to simply uncover the deeply hidden offshore gambling accounts, proving definitively, totally, absolutely, once and for all, that Jessica was the sole, solitary, true culprit. He expected to find absolute, completely undeniable, solid proof of my total, absolute, total innocence. What the aggressive, highly skilled forensic investigator actually found absolutely, completely, totally shattered Marcus' fragile understanding of basic reality. The sharp, seasoned investigator easily, effortlessly, quickly tracked the clumsy, sloppy, utterly basic digital path of the stolen $200,000 straight, directly, immediately back to Jessica hidden. Offshore accounts entirely perfectly corroborating my absolute, complete, undeniable innocence and entirely perfectly matching the damning, explosive, hidden camera footage I had already sent to the federal authorities. But the deeply skilled investigator did not stop there. The investigator was incredibly, exceptionally thorough. While aggressively, fiercely digging deeply through the massive, incredibly complex, highly tangled financial wreckage of the entire Sterling family, the incredibly sharp investigator noticed a completely, seemingly totally unrelated, incredibly massive, incredibly highly secure financial anomaly. The investigator stumbled entirely accidentally upon a massive, completely silent, fully incredibly funded anonymous shell corporation, a massive, incredibly powerful holding company, quietly, cleanly, meticulously registered directly, precisely, explicitly in the exact name of Maya Sterling. When the shocked, exhausted investigator finally nervously, quietly handed the incredibly thick, heavily sealed, deeply confidential file directly to Marcus, he watched his wealthy, powerful client face morph from absolute intense, furious, burning rage to complete, utter, staggering, total disbelief. The highly secure, deeply hidden shell corporation did not just hold the pathetic missing $200,000. The massive, incredibly complex, anonymous corporate trust currently held completely clean, perfectly untraceable liquid assets totaling wildly, easily, perfectly deep into the tens of millions of dollars. The incredibly massive funds had been legally, legitimately wired fully, cleanly, totally seamlessly from a massive, major, incredibly powerful global financial institution, confirming completely, absolutely, immediately that the staggering, enormous fortune was not stolen, it was fully, legitimately, actively earned. And just 3 short days ago, that massive, incredibly powerful anonymous shell company had smoothly, quietly, cleanly executed a staggering, massive, jaw-dropping single cash transaction. The company had purchased a completely flawless, fully sprawling, incredibly secure, massive, ultra-luxury oceanfront estate in Maui, Hawaii for perfectly $40 million, completely, totally, cleanly in liquid cash. Marcus sat alone perfectly still in his massive, quiet, luxury office, staring completely blindly at the highly confidential, thick file. His brilliant, highly analytical, incredibly successful mind spun violently, wildly out of total, absolute control. He had just watched my father throw me aggressively out onto a freezing, cold, wet concrete porch, screaming loudly, violently at me over a pathetic missing $200,000. He had stood there quietly, silently, judging me heavily, intensely, believing I was a desperate, miserable, completely pathetic, failed corporate auditor who had finally violently cracked under pressure and desperately stolen a miserable, incredibly small sum of cash just to desperately somehow survive. He had absolutely, completely, entirely believed I was totally, completely weak, utterly, fundamentally broken, and completely, thoroughly financially trapped. He had no earthly idea. He had absolutely no clue that I was secretly, incredibly, wildly wealthy, deeply, undeniably, infinitely richer than the rest of the entire miserable Sterling family combined. He drove incredibly frantically, aggressively, recklessly, straight to Richard's completely dark, quiet suburban house, his knuckles tight, absolutely white on the leather steering wheel. The massive, heavy front door was already unlocked when he aggressively, furiously stormed inside. Richard and Jessica were sitting closely together, completely huddled, fearfully, terribly in the dimly lit living room, both looking incredibly, severely, deeply haggard, heavily pale, and completely, thoroughly terrified by the sudden, massive, overwhelming federal raid on the corporate office. They jumped violently, nervously, when Marcus forcefully, loudly slammed the incredibly thick, heavy confidential forensic file directly straight down onto the glass coffee table right in front of them. He did not yell. He did not scream. He simply stared completely intensely down at his incredibly, severely flawed, entirely evil wife, and his incredibly arrogant, completely ignorant father-in-law with a look of pure, absolute, unadulterated, burning, cold hatred. He calmly, slowly, meticulously revealed absolutely perfectly exactly everything the incredibly highly paid forensic investigator had just found. He smoothly, quietly, clinically laid out the undeniable, solid, concrete proof of Jessica's massive, hidden offshore gambling debts, the perfect, absolute proof of his own highly, illegally, deeply forged signature on the massive, catastrophic loan guarantees, and the incredibly, shockingly, utterly, completely undeniable, mind-blowing absolute truth about my deeply hidden, completely, incredibly massive $40 million Hawaiian estate. Richard and Jessica simply stopped, completely, totally breathing. The sheer, intense, absolute, impossible magnitude of the shocking, incredible, staggering information hit them completely, utterly, violently, like a sudden, massive, terrifying physical blow. They stared completely, totally, blankly, blindly at the incredibly thick, heavy file, completely, utterly, totally unable to logically, rationally process the massive, shocking, deeply terrifying reality that the quiet, deeply submissive, pathetic, heavily abused daughter they had just brutally, aggressively, violently thrown out into the cold, freezing rain was actually incredibly, secretly, wildly a massive multimillionaire who could have easily, casually, comfortably bought and completely, thoroughly sold their entire fake, crumbling, miserable lives 10,000 times over. But their intensely deep, toxic, profound, unyielding arrogance and their deep, fundamental, intense greed completely, utterly, entirely blinded them to the absolute, undeniable, completely, totally, perfectly obvious truth. They completely, utterly, deeply refused to believe that I could have possibly legitimately, actively, brilliantly earned that incredibly staggering, massive amount of pure, clean money on my own. Their deeply sick, toxic, heavily twisted, incredibly, profoundly greedy minds immediately, rapidly, violently jumped to the incredibly, absolutely, completely, wildly wrong conclusion. They falsely, wildly, completely, incredibly, stupidly assumed that I had somehow magically, brilliantly, secretly, completely stolen tens of millions of dollars directly, straight, entirely from them. 3 days after I walked away from the freezing rain and the shattered remains of my life in Seattle, I was sitting on the expansive, sun-drenched lanai of my Hawaiian estate. The morning was incredibly serene. The vibrant turquoise water of the Pacific Ocean stretched out endlessly before me, completely undisturbed, except for the gentle, rhythmic crashing of the waves against the sharp, black volcanic cliffs far below. I was wrapped in a soft white silk robe, holding a warm cup of rich local coffee, simply breathing in the sweet, heavy scent of blooming tropical flowers. I had spent the last 72 hours completely detoxing from 29 years of chronic, severe psychological abuse. I was finally beginning to understand what actual true peace felt like. I was completely disconnected from the frantic, terrifying chaos I had deliberately unleashed upon my biological family. I had not checked the news. I had not looked at the hidden burner phone. I had simply allowed the incredibly sharp, highly aggressive federal authorities to do exactly what they do best. But true deep-rooted toxic entitlement rarely surrenders without a desperate violent struggle. The profound absolute quiet of my perfect tropical morning was suddenly cleanly interrupted by the soft, steady footsteps of David, my head of private security. He walked out onto the stone patio holding a sleek black digital tablet in his strong hands. His expression was completely neutral, highly professional, and rigidly serious. He stopped a few feet from my lounge chair and quietly informed me that we had a highly unexpected situation at the main security perimeter. He handed me the heavy tablet, and the high-definition security feed instantly brought the ugly, chaotic reality of my past violently crashing right back into my beautiful, pristine present. Through the incredibly sharp lens of the main gate security camera, I saw a dusty, cheap, compact rental car idling aggressively on the sweeping paver driveway just outside my towering, solid black iron gates. It was absolutely not the kind of luxury vehicle that typically approached an exclusive $40 million private residential compound. It was the exact kind of basic economic sedan you rent when you are entirely out of viable financial options. Standing right outside the driver's side door, physically leaning against the hot metal roof of the cheap car, was my father. The visual contrast between the deeply terrifying, violently aggressive man who had hurled my suitcase into the mud just 3 days ago and the pathetic, sweating, completely unhinged man currently standing on my high-definition security screen was absolutely staggering. Richard looked like he had easily aged 10 full years in a mere 72 hours. His expensive tailored dress shirt was heavily, deeply wrinkled and completely soaked straight through with thick, dark patches of nervous, anxious sweat. His face was intensely pale, his eyes wildly, frantically darting around, scanning the massive stone walls and the towering royal palm trees with a look of pure, unadulterated, greedy desperation. Standing a few feet away from him, pacing erratically back and forth across the smooth paving stones, was my older sister, Jessica. The pampered, perfectly curated golden child was completely, totally unraveling right in front of the security lens. Her normally flawless, expensive blonde blowout was a tangled, messy disaster completely ruined by the thick, heavy, humid island air. She was wearing designer sunglasses to hide her face, but I could clearly, distinctly see her violently biting her perfectly manicured fingernails, right down to the quick. She looked like a trapped, terrified animal, completely stripped of all her usual smug, arrogant, untouchable confidence. They had actually done it. They had somehow incredibly miraculously found their way to my absolute private sanctuary. I knew instantly exactly how they had managed this desperate final journey. With their massive corporate accounts entirely frozen by the aggressive federal raid and Jessica's secret offshore gambling funds completely locked down by the authorities, they must have been absolutely, totally financially suffocated. They must have frantically, desperately maxed out their very last functional personal credit card, just to afford 3 last-minute commercial economy plane tickets to Maui. The sheer profound indignity they must have felt flying in coach, sitting rigidly in cramped seats while their entire fake wealthy empire burned completely to the ground. Back in Washington must have been absolute agonizing torture for their incredibly massive toxic egos. But it was the third figure on the security screen that completely, entirely held my absolute focus. Standing quietly, purposefully, slightly apart from the frantic, chaotic pacing of my father and sister was Marcus. My highly successful, incredibly sharp African-American brother-in-law stood perfectly, totally still, his arms crossed loosely over his broad chest. He was wearing a dark, lightweight suit, looking perfectly calm and completely composed despite the thick tropical heat. Unlike Richard and Jessica, who were openly, aggressively sweating and completely panicking, Marcus looked exactly like a highly trained, calculating predator, patiently, quietly observing a pair of completely foolish, deeply doomed animals. He was not pacing. He was not biting his nails. He was simply standing there, staring directly up at the high-definition security camera lens with an expression of intense, profound, deeply analytical waiting. He knew exactly what was happening. He had seen the absolute, undeniable proof from his private forensic investigator. He knew Jessica had ruthlessly forged his signature to secure her massive illegal offshore gambling debts. He knew Richard had deliberately, maliciously framed me for the stolen $200,000. He knew perfectly, absolutely well, that I was completely innocent and incredibly, wildly wealthy. He had not flown all the way to Hawaii to frantically beg for his financial life. He had flown all the way here to personally, quietly, intimately watch his toxic evil wife and his incredibly arrogant father-in-law finally violently choke on the massive terrifying consequences of their own disgusting actions. He was a silent, highly lethal observer, willingly, actively walking them right directly into my waiting trap. I sat perfectly still on my beautiful sunlit lanai, holding the heavy black tablet in my hands, watching the pathetic, desperate scene unfold on the glowing screen. For my entire adult life, I had been deeply, incredibly terrified of my father's explosive, volatile anger. I had spent countless, agonizing, sleepless nights, desperately wondering how I could possibly avoid making him scream at me, how I could somehow miraculously earn a single tiny crumb of his genuine approval. But looking at him now, frantically, desperately wiping thick, nervous sweat from his red forehead, as he stared up at my massive, towering security gates, I felt absolutely, completely nothing. The deep, heavy, suffocating fear was completely, permanently gone. The pathetic, desperate, lifelong need for his validation was entirely, totally erased. I pressed my finger firmly down on the small green microphone icon on the tablet screen, instantly opening the direct two-way audio communication line to the heavy iron front gates. The connection clicked loudly, echoing sharply clearly down the long stone driveway. My father instantly, aggressively, visibly jumped at the sudden sharp electronic sound. He rushed frantically, awkwardly toward the small silver intercom box mounted securely on the heavy stone pillar. He practically physically threw himself against the call button, his hands shaking visibly violently on the security feed. When he finally spoke, his voice crackled loudly through the small speaker in my hands, and the sheer absolute staggering audacity of his incredibly completely fabricated tone genuinely almost made me drop the tablet. "Maya, sweetie," he cried out, his voice thick, heavy, and completely saturated with incredibly fake, pathetic, desperate crocodile tears. "Maya, honey, please tell me you are in there. Please answer the gate. It is your father." I simply stared at the high-definition screen, completely mesmerized by the absolute, incredible, profound depth of his toxic manipulation. "Sweetie, honey," he had not called me by a single affectionate nickname since I was a tiny, heavily neglected child. Just 3 incredibly short days ago, he had stood violently, aggressively over me on a freezing, wet concrete porch, his face twisted in pure, unadulterated, screaming hatred, explicitly calling me the absolute trash of his family. He had violently, forcefully thrown me out into a freezing, dark, dangerous storm, completely intentionally demanding that I get out and stay out forever. And now standing directly outside the massive towering gates of a $40 million ultra-luxury estate, he was desperately, violently attempting to instantly, perfectly rewrite history. He was actively, eagerly trying to slip right back into the familiar, comfortable role of the loving, caring, deeply concerned patriarch, as if the horrific, violent, abusive nightmare on the porch had simply, absolutely, never ever occurred. "Maya, please," he continued to beg through the crackling speaker, his voice rising into a high-pitched, pathetic, desperate whine. "You have to open these gates right now. You have to let us inside. We are in terrible, agonizing trouble. The logistics company is under a massive, aggressive, terrifying attack. The federal agents, the IRS, they completely raided the corporate offices yesterday morning. They aggressively, ruthlessly took everything, Maya. They seized the heavy servers, they took all the physical filing cabinets, they completely, totally froze every single one of my bank accounts. It is a massive, horrific, terrifying mistake. It is a giant, unbelievable federal misunderstanding." He actually paused dramatically, trying incredibly desperately to force a loud, wet, pathetic sob through the outdoor intercom speaker. Jessica stopped her frantic, anxious pacing and stepped closely, quickly right up behind him, peering nervously, fearfully over his sweating shoulder at the dark, unblinking lens of the security camera. She took off her expensive designer sunglasses, revealing dark, heavy, purple, exhausted bags, completely circling her normally perfectly, completely flawless eyes. She looked absolutely, totally, entirely terrified. "We desperately, intensely need your help, Maya," my father pleaded, his voice trembling, vibrating violently with incredibly fake, heavily manufactured sorrow. "You are my brilliant, capable, wonderful daughter. You are the absolute only person in this entire world who truly, fully, deeply understands the incredibly complex internal company finances. We aggressively need you to come back home to Seattle right now. We desperately need you to talk to these ruthless federal investigators. and carefully, completely, calmly explain that this is all just a massive, ridiculous, terrible accounting error. I kept my finger pressed completely silently down on the microphone button, absolutely, totally refusing to give him the profound, absolute luxury of hearing my steady, calm voice just yet. I wanted him to completely, fully, entirely expose the absolute deep, bottomless depth of his incredibly sick, toxic, unbelievable entitlement. I wanted to hear precisely how incredibly far his massive, raging, unchecked narcissism would actually confidently stretch. And Maya, he said, his voice suddenly drastically shifting, dropping the fake weeping sorrow and taking on a deeply intense, desperate, incredibly greedy tone. Marcus told us absolutely everything. He completely, finally explained everything about this incredibly massive, beautiful house. He explained perfectly exactly what you have been secretly, privately, quietly building all these years. We know absolutely, completely, totally everything now, sweetie. He paused again, forcefully wiping another thick, heavy layer of nervous, anxious sweat from his deeply pale face. He leaned closer, intensely, intimately closer to the silver intercom box, his wide, greedy eyes staring completely directly straight into the tiny black camera lens, as if he could somehow magically, forcefully see right through the digital screen directly into my very soul. We desperately, entirely, urgently need to use your new house as emergency corporate collateral, he stated, his voice completely, utterly, entirely devoid of any actual genuine shame or human hesitation. The ruthless, aggressive federal agents are actively, violently threatening to permanently, completely seize all the physical company assets by the end of the week. They are loudly, forcefully talking about securing massive, devastating emergency indictments. We frantically, intensely need a massive infusion of completely clean liquid cash. Right exactly now to hire the best, most incredibly expensive, aggressive corporate defense attorneys in the entire country. We desperately, instantly need to leverage the entire total absolute value of this massive $40 million estate to save our family legacy from total, complete, absolute, total destruction. You have to sign the legal emergency transfer papers right now, Maya. You have to immediately, willingly, bravely sacrifice this massive house to save your own family. Family absolutely, perfectly, always, forever comes first. You completely owe us this. The absolute, complete, staggering, monumental audacity of his deeply, incredibly entitled demand genuinely, truly, completely, physically took my breath away. He was actively, loudly, aggressively standing outside the massive secure gates of a multi-million-dollar private sanctuary that I had personally, independently, brilliantly earned, and he was boldly, confidently, forcefully demanding that I instantly, legally hand over the entire absolute total property just to save him from the exact precise federal criminal charges that he had literally, specifically, maliciously, meticulously plotted to completely ruin my own life with. He fundamentally, genuinely, actually believed that simply because he was my biological father, he possessed the absolute, divine, total, unshakable right to simply, confidently reach out and actively, aggressively consume everything I had ever independently, beautifully built. He completely, fully believed that I was still the exact same pathetic, weak, deeply broken, subservient little girl who would simply instantly fold, immediately, desperately cave, and willingly, entirely set myself completely on a blazing hot fire just to keep him comfortably, completely, perfectly warm. He honestly, completely, totally, truly believed that the incredibly massive fortune I had quietly, successfully, secretly earned was actually rightfully, absolutely his to aggressively, recklessly, completely squander. Even now, standing absolutely, totally terrified. Completely, entirely ruined, thoroughly, deeply, publicly exposed by a massive, catastrophic federal raid, he still incredibly, fundamentally, firmly believed that I owed him my absolute, total salvation. I sat back deeply, incredibly comfortably into the soft plush cushions of my beautiful sunlit outdoor lanai chair. I looked at the sleek black digital tablet resting heavily, powerfully, securely in my calm, steady hands. I looked closely, intensely at my father, deeply sweating, intensely desperate, panicked face. I looked perfectly, exactly at Jessica, heavily ruined, incredibly panicked, miserable expression. And I looked directly, purposefully, deeply at Marcus, standing quietly, patiently, stoically in the background, watching the exact, absolute, incredible, profound trap perfectly, flawlessly, seamlessly snap, entirely, completely shut. I did not feel any lingering, heavy, agonizing anger. I did not feel any deep, suffocating, dark sadness. I only felt a beautiful, pure, crystal clear, brilliant, incredibly dangerous sense of absolute, final, permanent, total, absolute closure. They had happily, cheerfully, eagerly dug their own incredibly deep, dark, massive graves with their own astonishing, profound, unchecked, disgusting, absolute greed. And now they had spent their very last, completely maxed out functional dime just to eagerly, enthusiastically, actively fly thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean, just to cheerfully, boldly, absolutely blindly jump directly right into the cold, dark, waiting dirt. I slowly, deeply, calmly inhaled the sweet, incredibly beautiful, rich, tropical Hawaiian air. I pressed my steady, calm, perfectly manicured finger, absolutely firmly, perfectly heavily, down onto the bright glowing green electronic button on the digital screen, immediately, instantly, remotely unlocking the massive solid black heavy iron front security gates. The real, genuine, beautiful, devastating, absolute total show was officially completely, finally about to brilliantly, beautifully, perfectly, absolutely begin. I watched the glowing green light on my sleek black digital tablet, confirmed that the massive heavy iron security gates were silently, smoothly opening. The incredibly quiet mechanical hum echoed faintly up the long, winding paved driveway. I knew I had exactly precisely 3 minutes before their cheap rented economy sedan reached the grand front entrance of my sprawling, luxurious oceanfront estate. I completely, instantly realized that the incredibly stunning, perfectly tailored emerald green silk designer dress I was currently wearing was far too powerful, far too incredibly intimidating for the specific psychological warfare I was about to expertly, flawlessly execute. I needed to carefully, meticulously prepare my grand stage. I urgently, quickly rushed back up the floating glass staircase directly into my incredibly massive sunlit master suite. I swiftly, completely stripped off the heavy, luxurious silk fabric, letting it pool beautifully elegantly onto the pristine, shining bamboo floor. I urgently, frantically dug deeply into the very bottom of my woven laundry hamper and pulled out the exact same incredibly cheap, oversized, faded beige synthetic sweater and the heavily worn, baggy, shapeless gray sweatpants I had been wearing on that freezing, dark, wet concrete porch back in Seattle just 3 short, agonizing days ago. I pulled the rough, scratchy, cheap fabric heavily over my head, instantly, completely transforming my physical outward appearance. I walked quickly directly over to the massive gilded floor-to-ceiling bathroom mirror and critically, carefully examined my reflection. I reached up with trembling fingers and completely, purposefully, forcefully tangled my clean, dark hair into a messy, frantic, chaotic, heavy knot. I aggressively, violently rubbed the delicate, sensitive skin underneath my dark eyes until it was incredibly, severely raw bright red and intensely puffy, perfectly mimicking the exact physical aftermath of a massive, endless, hysterical crying fit. I deeply hunched my strong shoulders forward completely, entirely shrinking my physical posture until I looked exactly perfectly, undeniably, like the pathetic, incredibly weak, deeply broken, easily manipulated, subservient, little corporate victim they so desperately, incredibly, urgently needed me to be. The loud, incredibly harsh, aggressive crunching sound of cheap rubber tires rolling violently over the pristine, decorative white gravel of my circular driveway signaled their highly anticipated arrival. I walked incredibly slowly, deliberately down the grand, floating glass staircase, letting my bare feet pad softly, silently against the cool, smooth mahogany floors. I reached the massive, towering, heavy double front doors exactly precisely at the very same moment Richard began aggressively, violently, loudly pounding his heavy, thick fist against the expensive, beautiful carved wood. I took one last deep, heavy, incredibly steadying breath, completely, fully submerging myself entirely into the pathetic, weak character I had played for 29 agonizing years. I reached out with a perfectly manufactured, violent tremble in my pale hands and slowly, quietly opened the massive, heavy door, just a tiny, small crack, peering out at them with incredibly wide, intensely terrified, fearful, red, puffy eyes. Richard almost completely violently pushed his heavy sweating body forcefully through the small opening, completely entirely ignoring the breathtaking, incredibly massive multi-million-dollar luxury foyer spreading out endlessly before him. He was profusely, heavily sweating, panting incredibly loudly, his chest heaving violently, completely, entirely consumed by his own massive, desperate, incredibly toxic financial greed. Jessica followed right closely behind him, stepping incredibly carefully over the smooth stone threshold in her highly expensive, strappy designer sandals. She looked rapidly, eagerly around the massive, sprawling, pristine oceanfront estate with a look of pure, naked, intensely ugly, burning jealousy that was instantly, rapidly masked by her usual deeply, incredibly arrogant, familiar, cruel sneer. Marcus walked in last, stepping quietly, silently, deliberately into the cool, shaded, massive foyer, closing the heavy front door firmly, securely behind him. "Maya, sweetie!" Richard gasped loudly, lunging aggressively, violently forward to awkwardly, forcefully wrap his heavy, wet, sweaty arms entirely around my violently trembling, shrinking shoulders. I immediately, rapidly shrank backward completely, entirely executing a perfect, flawless, incredibly realistic, terrified flinch. I deliberately, purposely let my breathing become incredibly rapid and extremely shallow, perfectly, completely mimicking the exact terrifying physical onset of a massive, impending, severe panic attack. Dad, I am so incredibly sorry. I stammered weakly, pushing the highly pathetic, weak words directly through a perfectly manufactured, loud, choking sob. I honestly, completely, truly did not know what to do. I was so incredibly, intensely, deeply scared and so totally alone. Richard gripped my upper arms incredibly tightly, his thick, heavy fingers digging painfully deeply into the incredibly cheap, thin, faded fabric of my oversized beige sweater. "It is completely, perfectly okay, honey." He lied effortlessly, his deep, loud voice dripping heavily with incredibly sickening, completely fake manufactured warm paternal affection. "We are absolutely finally here now. We are a family, and we are going to completely, perfectly fix this massive, terrible, deeply unfortunate federal misunderstanding together." I let the heavy, fake tears freely, completely spill over my lower lashes, tracking incredibly hot and fast straight down my pale, sunken cheeks. I nodded eagerly, violently, desperately, exactly precisely like a starving, beaten dog, pathetically begging for a single tiny microscopic scrap of basic human affection. Richard did not waste a single valuable, precious second pretending to actually care about my emotional state. His incredible, massive, toxic, overwhelming greed was completely, entirely overriding any basic tiny shred of normal human decency. "Maya, you have to listen to me incredibly carefully," he urged, his voice dropping rapidly into a harsh, urgent, intensely desperate, raspy whisper. "The ruthless, aggressive federal agents are completely, utterly destroying our entire family legacy. They are going to completely, legally seize the entire logistics company by early tomorrow morning. We desperately, urgently, intensely need a massive, immediate emergency injection of completely clean liquid capital. We need to instantly, completely, legally transfer the total, absolute legal ownership of this incredibly massive, beautiful house directly straight into a secure private family trust." I widened my violently red, incredibly puffy eyes, looking directly up at his sweating face with absolute, total, completely manufactured, blind, naive trust. "A legal property transfer." I whispered softly, my voice cracking completely, perfectly, authentically on the very last quiet syllable. "But Dad, I just finally bought this beautiful, safe place. It is absolutely, totally, entirely all I have left in the whole entire world." Richard forcefully, violently shook me exactly, precisely, the terrible, intimidating way he always heavily used to whenever I completely failed to balance his incredibly messy, chaotic corporate ledgers fast enough. "Do not be incredibly, intensely stupid and horribly, entirely selfish, Maya," he snapped viciously, his fake, loving paternal mask slipping dangerously for one brief, incredibly terrifying second before he quickly, forcibly, violently shoved it right back perfectly into place. "If you do not quickly, legally sign the emergency federal property transfer documents, right this exact, perfectly specific second, the incredibly ruthless federal government will absolutely, totally take absolutely everything we own. They will legally, violently take this beautiful, massive house. They will forcefully throw your own actual flesh and blood, father straight directly into a dark, freezing federal penitentiary for 30 long, miserable years. You have to bravely, absolutely, instantly sign this entire massive house completely over to me right now to completely logically, safely save our entire family. I dramatically, heavily buried my pale, wet face entirely in my violently trembling, pale hands, letting my hunched shoulders heave uncontrollably with massive, incredibly heavy, fake, dramatic sobbing. I wailed loudly, pathetically, directly into my wet palms, completely, perfectly, flawlessly playing the precise, incredibly familiar role of the incredibly weak, completely broken, easily, incredibly manipulated, pathetic family scapegoat. Okay, Dad, I cried out loudly, my voice heavily muffled and intensely, deeply, profoundly pathetic. Okay, I will absolutely, completely, legally sign absolutely anything you possibly intensely want. I will completely, willingly, eagerly do absolutely anything to financially, legally help you and Jessica right now. I just desperately, intensely, deeply want us all to be a real, loving, happy family again. I am so incredibly, deeply, intensely sorry for quietly, cowardly running away from you. I looked up slowly, timidly through my incredibly messy, wet, tangled dark hair, completely, perfectly, flawlessly performing total, absolute, unconditional, pathetic submission. Richard let out a massive, incredibly heavy, long sigh of pure, intense, deep, immense relief. His dark, incredibly greedy, desperate eyes lit up brilliantly with absolute, terrifying, wicked, incredibly dark, victorious joy. He honestly, completely, totally, incredibly, firmly believed that he had just flawlessly, effortlessly, seamlessly, completely successfully stolen an entire massive $40 million prime Hawaiian real estate property directly straight from his incredibly, stupid, terribly naive, heavily abused daughter. Standing just a few short feet away in the massive, brilliantly sunlit, gorgeous foyer, Jessica slowly, comfortably crossed her thin arms directly over her pristine, perfectly clean, white, expensive cashmere sweater. She looked around the breathtaking, magnificent architectural oceanfront masterpiece, completely, practically, physically, salivating heavily over the incredibly expensive custom-imported furniture and the truly endless, sparkling, bright blue ocean views. She turned her blonde head slightly, gracefully, leaning incredibly closely toward Marcus, who was standing completely, perfectly, entirely still, just inside the heavy, solid front security doors. A slow, incredibly wicked, deeply, intensely arrogant, cruel, familiar smirk spread completely, entirely across her flawless, heavily expensive makeup-covered, beautiful face. "Just look at her," Jessica whispered incredibly softly to her wealthy husband, her quiet, hushed tone completely, heavily, deeply dripping with absolutely pure, incredibly toxic, vile, disgusting, arrogant contempt. "She's honestly still an incredibly pathetic, totally miserable, incredibly weak little pushover. She literally has absolutely, completely zero actual human spine in her entire pathetic body. I completely, honestly, truly, deeply thought we were actually going to have to forcefully, aggressively, violently, physically threaten her to get the deed. But she is actually happily, willingly, happily handing over a massive $40 million private estate just purely simply because Daddy slightly loudly yelled at her. It is genuinely, incredibly, terribly pathetic to watch. We are going to be infinitely, significantly, heavily richer than we ever incredibly, possibly, completely dreamed, Marcus." Jessica let out a short, incredibly wicked, intensely evil little quiet laugh, completely, fully, entirely, deeply believing she had just easily, instantly, cleanly won the absolute ultimate massive global financial lottery. She totally, firmly, incredibly, deeply believed that by tonight, she would absolutely be casually sipping incredibly expensive, imported vintage champagne, completely comfortably lounging out on my private sunny oceanfront lanai, while I was completely, legally, permanently, incredibly stripped of my entire massive secret private fortune. She was entirely, completely, thoroughly, absolutely certain that her incredibly brilliant, flawless, toxic manipulation had perfectly, completely worked. But she was far, far too incredibly blind, completely, heavily, intensely consumed by her own massive, raging, incredibly deep narcissism to actually logically closely look at her deeply silent, highly intelligent husband. I slowly, carefully lowered my violently trembling, pale, wet hands directly from my heavily tear-stained, pathetic face while I was still actively, heavily, dramatically sobbing incredibly loudly. I looked directly straight past Richard, incredibly sweaty, wildly greedy, intensely desperate, pale face. I looked directly straight right past Jessica, incredibly wicked, totally arrogant, intensely smug, evil, beautiful smirk. I locked my dark eyes completely, intensely, directly, absolutely firmly with Marcus. Marcus did not say a single tiny solitary word. He did not quickly, foolishly agree with his incredibly, incredibly evil, heavily toxic wife. He did not smile happily at the supposedly incredibly easy, massive, sudden real estate victory they had just seemingly cleanly secured. He simply stood there, perfectly solidly, in his sharp, dark, expensive, tailored suit, completely, perfectly, entirely, incredibly motionless. His dark, highly intelligent, incredibly sharp analytical eyes were incredibly fiercely, heavily, deeply locked, completely, permanently onto mine. And in that one single brief, incredible, fleeting, highly intense, perfectly silent moment across the massive, incredibly luxurious, quiet, tropical foyer, and incredibly profound. Massive, completely silent, absolute heavy understanding passed directly, instantly, powerfully between us. While my small, pale, pathetic face was completely, tragically, heavily crumpled in fake, incredibly pathetic, intense agony, while my slender, weak shoulders actively, violently, constantly shook with completely, perfectly manufactured, desperate, pathetic sobs. And while my shaking mouth continuously, rapidly babbled incredibly weak, incredibly pathetic, deeply desperate, endless apologies, my eyes told completely, entirely, undeniably different, terrifying story. There was absolutely zero tiny trace of weak, pathetic fear anywhere deep in my dark irises. There was absolutely zero lingering, pathetic sadness. There was absolutely no pathetic, desperate, quiet submission anywhere hiding in my steady, intense gaze. My eyes were completely, perfectly, incredibly, intensely, entirely cold. They were two deep, dark, incredibly bottomless, absolutely endless wells of incredibly pure, highly calculated, deeply, intensely weaponized, cold rage. I stared completely, blankly, intensely, heavily, directly into Marcus' quiet soul, completely, deliberately, letting him completely, absolutely, fully, clearly see the incredibly terrifying, incredibly, highly, incredibly dangerous, completely lethal monster that his beautiful evil wife and his incredibly arrogant, deeply ignorant father-in-law had successfully, permanently, totally, completely created. I let him absolutely, completely, clearly, intensely see the incredibly massive, highly lethal, incredibly beautiful, complex legal trap that was actively, happily, rapidly, smoothly, silently closing tightly, permanently, heavily around his incredibly doomed, heavily toxic, deep biological family. Marcus steadily, calmly held my intense, incredibly terrifying, absolutely dead cold stare for a very long, heavy, deeply agonizing, entirely silent moment. He completely, fully, absolutely, immediately, instantly, logically recognized the incredibly, deeply, highly, incredibly lethal, purely predatory, violent intent hiding perfectly, silently, securely, right underneath my incredibly pathetic, oversized, faded, scratchy beige sweater. He clearly, visibly saw the incredibly, incredibly sharp, heavily bloody, entirely deeply lethal fangs resting perfectly, silently, securely, right safely, deeply behind my violently quivering, loudly crying wet lips. He knew instantly, immediately, logically, completely, undeniably, that I was absolutely, entirely, completely, perfectly, securely, in complete, total, absolute, highly devastating control of this entire, completely, totally miserable, pathetic human situation. A tiny, almost completely, incredibly imperceptible, incredibly, deeply cold shiver ran visibly straight, quickly down Marcus' broad, strong, perfect spine. He slowly, incredibly deliberately, completely firmly uncrossed his strong, thick arms and took one tiny, single, incredibly, completely silent physical step backward, perfectly, precisely, physically, intelligently, distancing himself entirely, completely, heavily, absolutely from his incredibly, deeply, incredibly arrogant, incredibly, deeply foolish, completely, absolutely, entirely doomed fake wife. He completely, absolutely, intensely, deeply understood that Richard and Jessica were actively, happily, aggressively, excitedly skipping directly, completely straight, deeply, right into a massive, incredibly blazing, roaring, entirely, totally lethal federal inferno. They were completely, totally, entirely, blindly celebrating a massive, incredible, total victory, deeply inside a closed room that was entirely, thoroughly, absolutely, invisibly, perfectly rigged with incredibly massive, highly explosive, completely, absolutely, totally invisible legal tripwires. I carefully gave Marcus one single, incredibly tiny, almost completely, entirely invisible, incredibly slight micro nod of pure, deeply cold, absolute, highly intentional, total finality. He did not physically warn them. He did not suddenly, desperately speak to them. He simply stood, completely, perfectly silently, heavily, deeply back in the cool dark shadows, absolutely incredibly, perfectly, totally prepared, and absolutely, entirely, incredibly, deeply, deeply, ready to silently, comfortably, intensely watch them, completely, thoroughly, absolutely, violently, heavily, beautifully, permanently, legally burned to the ground. I slowly turned away from the massive iron gates and gestured for my father and my sister to follow me deeper into the private estate. I kept my shoulders heavily slumped and my head bowed, perfectly maintaining the absolute illusion of a thoroughly defeated and incredibly terrified daughter. My father marched eagerly behind me, his heavy footsteps echoing loudly against the pristine, smooth stone walkway. He was practically vibrating with a highly toxic, greedy energy, completely unable to hide his intense, sudden excitement. Jessica walked right beside him, her designer heels clicking sharply against the expensive imported tiles. She was already looking around the lush, beautiful tropical courtyard, pointing out the expensive imported sculptures and the manicured exotic flora with a look of intense, hungry, absolute ownership. She completely believed that everything she was looking at would legally, permanently belong to her by the end of this very day. Marcus remained entirely silent, trailing a few slow steps behind them, his dark, highly intelligent eyes constantly analyzing every single minute detail of the massive property and every subtle, incredibly carefully calculated movement I made. I guided them smoothly through the massive sliding glass doors and straight into the main formal dining room, which I had recently completely converted into a sprawling executive boardroom. The space was an absolute breathtaking architectural marvel. 3 entire walls were constructed completely of seamless floor-to-ceiling glass, offering an uninterrupted, completely staggering panoramic view of the vast, endless Pacific Ocean and the dramatic, sharp, black volcanic cliffs dropping steeply, violently below. The bright, incredibly warm afternoon Hawaiian sun poured completely into the room, illuminating the massive solid slab of highly polished monkey pod wood that served as the central conference table. The sheer staggering monumental scale of the beautiful room and the intense aggressive natural beauty of the crashing waves outside forced even my incredibly arrogant father to completely pause for a tiny fraction of a second. He stared out at the sparkling bright turquoise water, his mouth hanging slightly open in pure unadulterated greedy awe. This was a level of extreme elite wealth he had only ever seen printed in glossy magazines. And now he firmly, absolutely believed he was about to easily steal it entirely for himself. I walked incredibly nervously over to a sleek, dark, built-in wet bar tucked perfectly into the corner of the massive room. My pale hands were still shaking with completely manufactured fear as I pulled a highly expensive bottle of perfectly chilled vintage champagne directly from the glass refrigerator. I opened it with a soft, muted pop, deliberately, completely fumbling slightly with the heavy, delicate crystal flutes to make myself appear even more incredibly intimidated, weak, and pathetic. I poured 3 generous glasses and carried them incredibly carefully over to the massive wooden table, placing them tentatively and submissively directly in front of my father and my sister. I did not offer a glass to Marcus. He and I both silently, completely, incredibly clearly understood that he was strictly a quiet observer in this deadly psychological game and absolutely not an active participant in their vile, disgusting celebration. Richard immediately eagerly grabbed his crystal flute with trembling, greedy hands, taking a massive, highly careless gulp of the expensive sparkling wine without offering a single solitary word of basic thanks. Jessica picked up her glass incredibly delicately, holding it directly up to the bright sunlight to smugly admire the rising bubbles before taking a slow, highly satisfied, deeply arrogant sip. "Please, just sit down," I whispered softly, my voice incredibly fragile and painfully thin. I looked down at the highly polished wooden floor, completely, absolutely refusing to make direct eye contact with their incredibly arrogant, triumphant faces. I called my private wealth attorney, Julian, the exact second you buzzed the front security gate. I told him there was a massive catastrophic family emergency back in Seattle and that we needed to act instantly to financially, legally save the corporate business. I told him to immediately perfectly draft the emergency property transfer deeds for this entire massive estate. He is currently actively printing the binding legal documents in his private office just down the hall, and he will be officially joining us right here in this room in exactly 5 short minutes. I forced another loud, pathetic, choking sob directly into my hands, rubbing my already raw, violently red eyes. "I just want to do absolutely whatever it takes to fix this terrible, massive mess, Dad. I just desperately, deeply want you to finally be proud of me, and I want us to be a normal, happy, safe family again." My father let out a loud, booming, incredibly triumphant laugh that completely, absolutely shattered the serene, tropical quiet of the massive glass room. He slammed his empty crystal flute down hard onto the incredibly expensive table, completely, totally careless of the delicate, polished wood. "That is my absolute brilliant, incredibly, incredibly good girl." He praised me, his deep voice dripping with such intense, sickeningly fake manufactured affection that it actually completely, genuinely made my stomach physically violently churn. "You are doing the absolute, exact, perfect right thing right now, Maya. This is exactly precisely what family fundamentally does for each other in times of terrible, unexpected crisis. We make massive, heavy, incredibly necessary sacrifices to completely aggressively protect our incredible, important legacy." He leaned back incredibly comfortably into the plush leather conference chair, expanding his large chest and crossing his arms with a look of pure, unadulterated, perfectly victorious smugness. He honestly, entirely, truly, absolutely believed he had just masterfully, brilliantly conned his completely naive, incredibly stupid little daughter out of a $40 million Hawaiian paradise. Jessica was not even bothering to slightly hide her intense, overwhelming, purely greedy joy. She walked slowly, incredibly arrogantly around the perimeter of the massive glass room, running her perfectly manicured fingers, lovingly, deeply, possessively, over the expensive custom-imported furniture. She stopped directly perfectly in front of the massive glass window wall, looking out at the crashing, violent ocean with a terrifying, deeply wicked, totally evil smile spreading completely entirely across her face. "We are absolutely going to have to do a massive, incredibly deep, extreme renovation of this entire specific place," she announced loudly, completely, entirely, ignoring my pathetic, shaking, crying form, standing just a few short feet away. The modern architectural bones are actually quite incredibly good, but the interior design is just incredibly, tragically basic and completely, totally, terribly boring. It completely lacks any real, actual, refined elite taste. We need to instantly rip up all these bamboo floors and probably completely, radically redesign the entire outdoor infinity pool deck to make it truly spectacular for hosting massive elite summer parties. She turned and looked directly at my father, her bright blue eyes gleaming blindingly with intense, deeply hungry anticipation. "Heapy hungry. We are going to be absolutely, completely, totally fine, Daddy. In fact, I genuinely strongly think we are actually going to be infinitely, fundamentally, vastly better than fine." The atmosphere inside that stunning, perfectly sun-drenched room was incredibly, incredibly, suffocatingly tense. The air felt massively, physically heavy, completely, incredibly thick, with their intense, radiating, highly toxic greed and their absolute blind, staggering, monumental arrogance. They were openly, loudly, gleefully, aggressively celebrating their imminent, massive theft right directly in front of my face. They were completely, actively, eagerly discussing exactly, precisely how they were going to beautifully, incredibly remodel and aggressively, perfectly utilize my private, hard-earned sanctuary, while simultaneously, absolutely casually planning to completely abandon me to a freezing, miserable, highly dangerous 30-year federal prison sentence back in Washington. They felt absolutely zero shame, zero tiny drops of remorse, and completely, totally zero normal human hesitation. They genuinely, firmly thought they had perfectly, cleanly, flawlessly won the absolute ultimate global financial lottery, and they were completely, thoroughly, intensely enjoying every single magnificent second of their incredible, deeply fake victory. I remained standing incredibly quietly in the dark corner of the beautiful room, hugging my rough, cheap, oversized, incredibly scratchy sweater tightly around my body, continuing to actively emit small, pathetic, muffled, terrified whimpers. But as I kept my head deeply, submissively bowed, perfectly, flawlessly, actively playing the absolute exact role of the incredibly weak, completely broken, easily manipulated, stupid victim, I secretly, completely, incredibly, deliberately shifted my dark gaze directly toward the very back of the room. Marcus had not moved a single physical inch since we first walked into the massive glass space. He was standing perfectly, rigidly, incredibly still, leaning completely casually against the dark, solid wooden doorframe with his strong arms crossed tightly defensively over his chest. He was actively, intensely, silently watching his incredibly toxic wife gleefully, intensely, incredibly, foolishly plan the massive, expensive renovation of a legally stolen mansion. He was actively watching his highly arrogant, incredibly, deeply foolish father-in-law boast loudly, happily about perfectly saving a completely fake, deeply doomed corporate legacy. And he was actively, quietly, incredibly, analytically watching me. He completely, vividly, deeply, clearly saw right through the incredibly cheap, incredibly baggy clothes. He saw completely, directly, perfectly straight through the incredibly raw, red, puffy crying eyes and the pathetic, desperate, loud sobbing. He completely, fully recognized the incredibly absolute, incredibly terrifying, highly dangerous, deadly stillness hiding perfectly, brilliantly, quietly underneath my incredibly chaotic, fragile, weak performance. He knew with absolute, stunning, completely crystal clear, undeniable certainty that the incredibly heavy, incredibly thick, deeply suffocating tension in this beautiful tropical room was absolutely not the sound of my family celebrating a massive, amazing, easy financial victory. He knew it was the incredibly terrifying, quiet, extremely heavy, undeniably loud sound of a massive, highly lethal, incredibly perfectly designed predatory trap, completely, flawlessly, hopelessly snapping, totally, completely, permanently, completely shut. The massive sliding glass doors closed behind us with a soft, heavy seal that completely muted the violent crashing of the ocean waves outside. I led my father, Richard, my sister, Jessica, and my brother-in-law, Marcus, directly into the center of my sprawling executive boardroom. The space was an absolute breathtaking architectural marvel, specifically designed to intimidate and command absolute respect. 3 entire walls were constructed completely of seamless floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass, offering an uninterrupted, completely staggering panoramic view of the vast, endless Pacific Ocean and the dramatic, sharp, black volcanic cliffs dropping steeply, violently below. The bright, incredibly warm afternoon Hawaiian sun poured completely into the room, illuminating the massive, solid slab of highly polished dark mahogany wood that served as the central conference table. The sheer, staggering, monumental scale of the beautiful room and the intense, aggressive natural beauty of the surrounding tropical landscape forced even my incredibly arrogant father to completely pause for a tiny fraction of a second. He stared out at the sparkling, bright turquoise water, his mouth hanging slightly open in pure, unadulterated, greedy awe. This was a level of extreme elite wealth he had only ever seen printed in glossy magazines or featured in high-end architectural documentaries. And now, standing in the absolute center of it all, he firmly, absolutely believed he was mere moments away from easily stealing it entirely for himself. I walked incredibly nervously over to a sleek, dark, built-in wet bar, tucked perfectly into the corner of the massive room. I deliberately kept my shoulders heavily slumped and my head bowed, perfectly maintaining the absolute illusion of a thoroughly defeated and incredibly terrified daughter. I was still wearing the incredibly cheap, oversized, faded beige synthetic sweater and the heavily worn, baggy, shapeless gray sweatpants I had put on specifically for this performance. My pale hands were actively shaking with completely manufactured fear as I pulled a highly expensive bottle of perfectly chilled vintage champagne directly from the glass refrigerator. I opened it with a soft, muted pop, deliberately, completely fumbling slightly with the heavy, delicate crystal flutes to make myself appear even more incredibly intimidated, weak and pathetic. I poured 3 generous glasses and carried them incredibly carefully over to the massive wooden table, placing them tentatively and submissively directly in front of my father and my sister. I did not offer a glass to Marcus. He and I both silently, completely, incredibly clearly understood that he was strictly a quiet observer in this deadly psychological game and absolutely not an active participant in their vile, disgusting celebration. Marcus had not moved a single physical inch since we first walked into the massive glass space. He was standing perfectly rigidly, incredibly still, leaning completely casually against the dark, solid wooden doorframe with his strong arms crossed tightly, defensively over his chest. He was actively, intensely, silently watching his incredibly toxic wife and his highly arrogant father-in-law blindly prepare to celebrate. "Please just sit down," I whispered softly, my voice incredibly fragile and painfully thin. I looked down at the highly polished wooden floor, completely, absolutely refusing to make direct eye contact with their incredibly arrogant, triumphant faces. I called my private wealth attorney, Julian, the exact second you buzzed the front security gate. I told him there was a massive catastrophic family emergency back in Seattle and that we needed to act instantly to financially, legally save the corporate business. I told him to immediately perfectly draft the emergency property transfer deeds for this entire massive estate. He is currently actively printing the binding legal documents in his private office just down the hall, and he will be officially joining us right here in this room in exactly 5 short minutes. I forced a loud, pathetic, choking sob directly into my hands, rubbing my already raw, violently red eyes. I just want to do absolutely whatever it takes to fix this terrible, massive mess, Dad. I just desperately, deeply want you to finally be proud of me, and I want us to be a normal, happy, safe family again. My father let out a loud, booming, incredibly triumphant laugh that completely, absolutely shattered the serene, tropical quiet of the massive glass room. He slammed his empty crystal flute down hard onto the incredibly expensive table, completely, totally careless of the delicate, polished wood. "That is my absolute brilliant, incredibly good girl." He praised me, his deep voice dripping with such intense, sickeningly fake manufactured affection that it actually completely genuinely made my stomach physically, violently churn. "You are doing the absolute, exact, perfect right thing right now, Maya. This is exactly precisely what family fundamentally does for each other in times of terrible, unexpected crisis. We make massive, heavy, incredibly necessary sacrifices to completely, aggressively protect our incredible, important legacy." He leaned back incredibly comfortably into the plush leather conference chair, expanding his large chest and crossing his arms with a look of pure, unadulterated, perfectly victorious smugness. He honestly, entirely, truly, absolutely believed he had just masterfully, brilliantly conned his completely naive, incredibly stupid little daughter out of a $40 million Hawaiian paradise. Jessica was not even bothering to slightly hide her intense, overwhelming, purely greedy joy. She walked slowly, incredibly arrogantly around the perimeter of the massive glass room, running her perfectly manicured fingers lovingly, deeply possessively over the expensive custom imported furniture. She stopped directly perfectly in front of the massive glass window wall, looking out at the crashing, violent ocean with a terrifying, deeply wicked, totally evil smile spreading completely entirely across her face. "We are absolutely going to have to do a massive, incredibly deep, extreme renovation of this entire specific place," she announced loudly, completely, entirely, ignoring my pathetic shaking, crying form, standing just a few short feet away. The modern architectural bones are actually quite incredibly good, but the interior design is just incredibly tragically basic and completely, totally, terribly boring. It completely lacks any real, actual, refined, elite taste. We need to instantly rip up all these bamboo floors and probably completely, radically redesign the entire outdoor infinity pool deck to make it truly spectacular for hosting massive elite summer parties. She turned and looked directly at my father, her bright blue eyes gleaming blindingly with intense, deeply hungry anticipation. "We are going to be absolutely, completely, totally fine, Daddy. In fact, I genuinely strongly think we are actually going to be infinitely, fundamentally, vastly better than fine." The atmosphere inside that stunning, perfectly sun-drenched room was incredibly suffocatingly tense. The air felt massively physically heavy, completely incredibly thick with their intense, radiating, highly toxic greed and their absolute blind, staggering, monumental arrogance. They were openly, loudly, gleefully, aggressively celebrating their imminent massive theft, right directly in front of my face. They were completely, actively, eagerly discussing exactly precisely how they were going to beautifully, incredibly remodel and aggressively, perfectly utilize my private, hard-earned sanctuary, while simultaneously, absolutely casually planning to completely abandon me to a freezing, miserable, highly dangerous 30-year federal prison sentence back in Washington. They felt absolutely zero shame, zero tiny drops of remorse, and completely, totally zero normal human hesitation. They genuinely, firmly thought they had perfectly, cleanly, flawlessly won the absolute ultimate global financial lottery, and they were completely, thoroughly, intensely enjoying every single magnificent second of their incredible, deeply fake victory. Exactly precisely 5 minutes after I had promised his arrival, the heavy, solid wood double doors at the end of the beautiful boardroom swung open. My private wealth and asset protection attorney, Julian, stepped smoothly, confidently into the bright, sunlit room. He did not look like a friendly local real estate lawyer ready to quickly, easily process a simple family property transfer. He looked exactly like a highly trained, incredibly ruthless corporate executioner. He was wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that commanded instant absolute respect, and his sharp, highly analytical face was locked into a mask of pure, cold, professional disgust. He did not offer a single warm greeting. He did not smile. He simply walked with slow, heavy, incredibly deliberate steps, straight toward the head of the massive mahogany table, holding an incredibly thick, incredibly massive black leather binder in his strong hands. The sheer physical weight of the heavy binder seemed to completely suck the oxygen right out of the tropical air. Richard instantly, aggressively lunged forward, his incredibly greedy eyes totally, completely locked onto the dark leather binder like it was a literal solid brick of pure glowing gold. He quickly, forcefully, aggressively pulled an expensive gold fountain pen straight out of his damp, wrinkled shirt pocket, violently clicking the cap off with a loud, sharp, metallic snap. He was practically salivating completely, utterly, entirely ready to blindly sign away my entire massive private fortune. Julian stopped directly across from my incredibly sweating, deeply arrogant father. He did not say a single tiny word. He simply raised the massive heavy binder slightly and dropped it perfectly flat, directly onto the center of the highly polished monkey pod wood table. The incredibly loud, incredibly heavy, devastating boom of the thick binder hitting the solid wood echoed violently, aggressively like a literal gunshot throughout the quiet glass room. Richard physically, visibly jumped at the sharp, sudden, deafening noise, but his intense, overwhelming, bottomless greed instantly, violently pushed him right back forward. "Oh, thank God," Richard gasped loudly, his voice completely dripping with incredibly fake, sickening, pathetic relief. He quickly, aggressively grabbed the heavy cover of the binder, eagerly, violently flipping it completely open. Let us just quickly, logically get all of this highly complicated legal paperwork entirely, instantly signed and officially completely processed. I will legally take over the primary holding trust and immediately, quickly, gracefully leverage the massive property value to fiercely, aggressively, legally fight those totally, completely ridiculous, insane federal agents back in Washington. Just quietly, quickly show me exactly perfectly where I need to heavily, legally sign Julian. My father, completely arrogant, totally smug, triumphant smile, froze permanently dead on his sweating face. The exact very second his greedy dark eyes actually physically registered the bold black printed words on the very first page. His heavy gold pen literally, entirely, completely slipped directly through his trembling, sweaty fingers, dropping loudly, heavily onto the thick paper. He did not see a standard tropical real estate deed. He did not see a simple legal voluntary property transfer agreement. He saw the massive, highly, incredibly intimidating, incredibly bold official seal of the United States Department of Justice staring directly, aggressively straight back up at him. Directly underneath that massive, terrifying seal were the incredibly official, incredibly bold, aggressive headers of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. He stared completely, totally blindly, blankly at the incredibly thick, heavy stack of absolutely entirely catastrophic federal documents. There were incredibly detailed, highly extensive, completely massive emergency asset seizure notices. There were absolute, complete, total federal property freeze orders, explicitly, cleanly, permanently locking down every single tiny, incredibly microscopic fraction of the failing Sterling Logistics Company. He slowly, with violently trembling fingers, turned the thick, heavy page. Right there, perfectly, neatly, beautifully tabbed, incredibly explicitly highlighted in the exact center of the massive, heavy binder, were the incredibly high-definition, perfectly clear, printed transcripts of the hidden camera footage. The documents displayed exact, precise timestamps matching the exact moment Jessica had forged my signature. The pages displayed completely undeniable, high-resolution still photographs, capturing the exact, precise physical movements of their horrific corporate crimes. Jessica immediately noticed her father completely, suddenly, totally, instantly stop breathing. She let out a highly annoyed, incredibly arrogant, deeply exasperated sigh, and quickly, aggressively pushed her way forward to the mahogany table, expecting to see a simple, minor, completely tiny, legal, clerical error. Dad just incredibly, completely legally signed the stupid, pathetic transfer documents. She aggressively snapped, her voice incredibly high-pitched and deeply, completely, wildly impatient. We literally, absolutely, completely, totally, heavily, entirely, desperately need this massive, incredibly giant pile of clean liquid cash. Right, this exact, incredibly, very second before the entire, completely, incredibly beautiful, absolute, totally perfect fake life we built, completely, heavily, utterly burns completely to the incredibly cold ground. She aggressively, forcefully leaned right over his incredibly rigid, frozen, sweating shoulder and looked completely, heavily straight down directly at the incredibly, highly detailed, totally explosive federal transcripts. Her incredibly expensive, flawless, beautifully, incredibly fake, arrogant, beautiful smile. Instantly, completely, totally, rapidly, completely, physically collapsed. She saw her own exact, precise spoken words completely, totally, heavily transcribed in stark, undeniable, perfectly clear black and white. She saw the incredibly high resolution, perfectly clear, incredibly brightly lit, incredibly beautifully timed color photographs of her own completely guilty hand, meticulously, cleanly, expertly, totally forging my exact precise signature right directly onto the incredibly massive, deeply, incredibly, heavily fraudulent offshore corporate bank ledgers. She began to physically, violently shake, letting out a low, terrified, completely horrifying, panicked gasp. I stood up incredibly slowly, incredibly purposefully from my dark, quiet corner. I completely, entirely, deeply, deliberately, physically dropped every single tiny microscopic remaining ounce of the incredibly pathetic, heavily, incredibly, wildly terrified, deeply broken, totally, severely beaten little girl act. I completely stopped the fake, heavy crying instantly. I wiped my face cleanly, completely, leaving my incredibly, deeply, completely, totally calm, intensely, absolutely sharp, incredibly, entirely, lethal, incredibly, deeply, deadly, completely cold expression, fully, entirely, beautifully, completely exposed. I reached my hands up and quickly, efficiently pulled the incredibly cheap, incredibly heavy, thoroughly, completely faded, rough beige synthetic sweater right directly straight, incredibly, totally, fiercely, heavily over my dark head. I tossed the incredibly ugly, pathetic, disgusting, heavily stained garment carelessly straight onto the beautiful floor completely, directly, totally, completely, fully, powerfully, revealing a perfectly, expertly, completely, perfectly sleek, incredibly highly tailored, deeply stunning, incredibly expensive black silk, completely powerful, incredibly gorgeous designer blouse underneath. I straightened my incredibly, completely perfect posture, pulling my incredibly, completely, entirely strong shoulders, perfectly, completely, beautifully, firmly, powerfully back until I was completely, heavily, totally, entirely standing at my full, incredibly, perfectly absolute, completely undeniable, full, completely commanding height. My voice, when I finally spoke, was no longer incredibly, terribly, wonderfully thin and shaky. My voice was pure, cold, heavy steel. You threw me out to make me your federal scapegoat. You threw me out onto a freezing wet porch and explicitly planned to send me to a federal penitentiary for 30 long miserable years just to save yourselves. But I wiped your hard drives before I left, and I sent the real files to the FBI. The absolute, heavy, suffocating silence inside the massive glass-walled tropical boardroom was violently, aggressively shattered by a high-pitched, guttural, terrifying scream that completely ripped directly through the pristine, warm Hawaiian air. It was absolutely not a desperate human scream of genuine sorrow or sudden tragic regret. It was the pure, primal, incredibly terrifying, furious shriek of a highly cornered, incredibly vicious wild predator, instantly realizing its perfect, flawless trap had completely, totally, unexpectedly failed. Jessica completely, instantly lost every single tiny microscopic ounce of her carefully cultivated, expensive, elite, polished socialite composure. Her flawlessly, perfectly manicured hands curled instantly into tight, violent, dangerous claws, and her perfectly painted, incredibly beautiful, expensive face twisted horribly violently into a dark, extremely hideous, ugly mask of pure, unadulterated, feral, raging, toxic fury. She violently, forcefully, aggressively kicked her incredibly heavy, plush, expensive leather conference chair backward, sending it sliding, loudly crashing against the smooth, polished, custom bamboo floor. With an incredibly sudden, terrifying, aggressive burst of incredibly intense manic energy, she lunged directly straight aggressively across the massive, solid mahogany executive table, completely ignoring the incredibly heavy black legal binders and the delicate, expensive crystal vintage champagne flutes. The highly expensive, perfectly chilled vintage champagne spilled violently, rapidly across the dark, polished wood, pooling heavily, deeply around the completely catastrophic, extremely terrifying official federal indictments. She completely, furiously, intensely, aggressively launched her slender, incredibly expensive designer-clothed body directly straight toward me, her bright blue eyes incredibly wide and totally crazed, screaming highly toxic, incredibly vicious, utterly vile curses at the absolute top of her deeply burning lungs. She desperately, wildly wanted to physically, completely, absolutely destroy me, to violently, aggressively tear the incredibly calm, perfectly victorious, deeply untouchable expression right, completely directly off my unbothered, intensely serene face. I did not even slightly, vaguely, tiny bit physically flinch. I simply stood completely, perfectly, totally, remarkably still, incredibly, deeply, firmly grounded, completely, absolutely in my own unquestionable, massive new secret power, completely, calmly, analytically watching her pathetic, incredibly desperate, completely, violent, emotional meltdown unfold, exactly, perfectly, precisely, exactly as I logically, entirely, analytically knew it absolutely would, before her aggressively, fiercely clawing, eagerly, reaching hands could even possibly come a single incredibly brief inch close to my perfectly tailored black silk blouse, a solid, massive, completely unmoving physical human wall, violently, forcefully, immediately, entirely intercepted her, completely out of control, highly wild trajectory. Marcus moved with an incredibly sudden, absolutely terrifying, completely absolute, highly lethal, perfectly precise speed. He reached directly out with one incredibly, massively strong, completely, utterly unyielding solid arm and forcefully, violently, intensely grabbed Jessica tightly, directly by her incredibly expensive soft cashmere shoulders, roughly, aggressively, heavily yanking her completely, entirely, incredibly powerfully backward, totally, forcefully, physically, entirely directly away from me. He threw her forcefully, intensely, heavily backward, and she stumbled entirely awkwardly, completely, totally losing her expensive, delicate designer balance and falling entirely, heavily, totally loudly, completely directly, right? Straight backward, entirely, deeply directly back, totally into her incredibly expensive, heavy, thick leather chair. She looked completely rapidly upward, directly, completely, exactly straight at her wealthy, incredibly powerful, highly successful, heavily furious husband, with wild, incredibly frantic, deeply, entirely, intensely, completely. Panicked, wildly terrified, incredibly heavy, wide eyes, entirely desperately, fully expecting him to blindly protect her, exactly, precisely, exactly as he had always. Dutifully, blindly, obediently, completely, faithfully, always done. She opened her completely, violently quivering, pale, wet mouth to violently, aggressively, completely, loudly, immediately, instantly spin another incredibly massive, deeply, incredibly, completely, entirely, heavily toxic, ridiculous lie. But the incredibly dark, deeply, completely, utterly, intensely, absolutely, entirely furious, completely cold, intensely cold look, entirely perfectly, directly sitting deeply, securely inside Marcus, perfectly deep, dark eyes, instantly, permanently, completely, entirely, effectively, thoroughly silenced her, completely, thoroughly, perfectly, entirely, completely, totally, utterly, immediately. He did not look directly, actively at her with any tiny, incredibly small, brief fraction of soft, lingering romantic love or highly perfectly husbandly concern. He looked directly, completely, actively, deeply, exactly, precisely, completely right at her, exactly, precisely, incredibly, absolutely, perfectly, totally, exactly, deeply, precisely, like she was a highly, entirely, completely, deeply venomous, intensely dangerous, heavily diseased insect that he had just caught, completely, aggressively crawling across his perfectly, incredibly, utterly pristine floor. Without saying a single, incredibly small, completely, absolutely, totally, completely, perfectly solitary, tiny, quiet word, Marcus slowly, deliberately reached his incredibly heavy, strong, completely, entirely steady, perfectly, calm, strong, heavy, deeply, perfectly solid, large hand, completely, directly, totally, completely, absolutely, incredibly straight, entirely, perfectly, directly, heavily straight, straight, totally, directly down, exactly, directly, perfectly right, completely, heavily, totally, strongly, forcefully onto the completely, perfectly, absolutely, completely, damp, incredibly, highly, heavily, totally, entirely, heavily, beautifully, absolutely, incredibly, utterly, incredibly expensive, polished, totally, completely, utterly, entirely, thoroughly, totally, heavily, perfectly, perfectly damp, heavily, totally, incredibly, totally, thoroughly, incredibly damp, absolutely, thoroughly damp, perfectly, perfectly damp, heavy mahogany, completely, totally, fully, perfectly heavy table, and aggressively, deeply, completely, incredibly, incredibly, entirely, deeply, totally, forcefully, totally, heavily snatched. The incredibly, incredibly thick, incredibly, fully, entirely, totally, utterly massive, heavy, perfectly, entirely, deeply, heavily, incredibly, entirely, completely, utterly, deeply, perfectly, totally, entirely, heavy, black, completely, utterly, entirely, perfectly, absolutely, complete, heavy, entirely, absolute, leather, completely, absolutely, incredibly, entirely, perfectly heavy black, totally, incredibly, utterly, perfectly, completely, completely, absolutely, totally, entirely, entirely, absolutely, incredibly, completely, entirely, totally, absolutely, utterly, perfect, absolutely, completely, entirely, total, entirely, perfectly, completely, fully, perfectly, 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 entirely, completely, thoroughly, completely, totally, perfectly, incredibly, entirely, completely, perfect, completely, entirely, absolutely, incredibly, incredibly, perfectly, incredibly, completely, perfectly, totally, incredibly, perfectly, entirely, incredibly, 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 perfectly, completely, perfectly, totally, incredibly, perfectly, absolutely, completely, perfectly, totally, absolutely, exactly, precisely, incredibly, highly, perfectly, completely, absolutely, exactly, directly, incredibly, heavily, deeply, fully, precisely. Right, completely, totally, perfectly, directly, incredibly heavy, totally, completely, entirely, incredibly, absolutely, incredibly, perfectly, deeply, incredibly, perfectly, directly straight, completely, heavily, entirely straight, exactly, utterly, perfectly straight, completely right, incredibly, deeply, perfectly, perfectly, heavily straight, right, completely right, perfectly, precisely out of the massive federal pile. Marcus lifted the heavy white paper, holding it completely steady in his large hands. He read the stark black printed words incredibly carefully, completely, silently absorbing every single devastating legal detail. I watched his strong jaw clench so tightly that a prominent muscle ticked visibly under his dark skin. I watched the horrible, absolute, undeniable truth slowly, permanently settle heavily into his brilliant analytical mind. He was looking directly at the incredibly high-resolution printed photographs of the forged bank authorization forms. He was staring completely directly at his own exact, precise personal signature, sitting boldly right there on the fraudulent transfer line. He instantly logically realized that the woman he had married had not only maliciously stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from her own innocent sister, but she had actively, ruthlessly, deliberately forged his personal signature to legally frame him for her own massive, disgusting, illegal corporate crimes. She had intentionally, completely, willfully set him up to take the entire devastating fall for her sick gambling addiction. The pure, intense, radiating fury that completely, instantly washed over Marcus' face was truly, absolutely terrifying to witness. The composed, quiet, stoic, highly successful corporate executive completely vanished. In his place stood a deeply betrayed, incredibly powerful, intensely angry man who had just discovered his entire marriage was a massive, dangerous financial trap. He slowly lowered the federal document, dropping it carelessly back onto the wet mahogany table. He slowly turned his head to look back at Jessica. She shrank visibly, physically backward, pressing her thin, shaking body deeply into the soft leather of her chair, desperately trying to somehow incredibly hide from his burning, intense gaze. Richard was actively, loudly hyperventilating next to her, completely paralyzed by the sheer, massive, catastrophic weight of his own total legal destruction. Marcus stared at them both with a look of incredibly profound, deep, heavy, absolute contempt. It was the deeply cold, final look of a powerful man who was permanently, cleanly, instantly cutting out a massive, rotting, toxic cancer from his successful life. Then Marcus slowly turned his dark, intense eyes away from them and looked directly, completely straight at me. The burning, heavy anger in his gaze immediately vanished the second he looked into my incredibly calm, dark eyes. He gave me a slow, deeply respectful, entirely understanding, solemn nod. He completely, fully recognized the absolute, masterful, brilliant trap I had perfectly, flawlessly executed. He knew I had deliberately ensured those specific, incredibly detailed, forged documents were perfectly placed right there on top of the massive pile, exactly specifically for him to easily, clearly find. I will testify to absolutely everything he said, his deep, rich voice echoing clearly, loudly, powerfully throughout the silent glass room. I am absolutely, entirely, completely finished with these disgusting, highly toxic, pathetic excuses for human beings. I will fully, actively, eagerly cooperate with the federal authorities. I have access to their private, hidden, secure servers back in Seattle. I have the secondary offshore account passwords they desperately, blindly thought I did not know about. I will legally, beautifully, permanently bury them both. At that exact, precise, perfectly timed, beautiful moment, the heavy, solid mahogany double doors of the boardroom swung completely, violently wide open. The loud, aggressive sound echoed sharply, heavily against the thick glass walls. A team of highly trained, heavily armed Maui local police officers marched swiftly, decisively, directly into the sunlit room, completely, instantly shattering the quiet, elite atmosphere of my private tropical estate. They were dressed in sharp, dark, authoritative uniforms, their heavy-duty utility belts clinking loudly, sharply with every single purposeful, synchronized step. They were moving in complete, perfect, seamless coordination with the federal authorities back in Washington, exactly, perfectly, precisely, just as my brilliant wealth attorney Julian had meticulously, flawlessly, carefully arranged. The lead officer, a tall, incredibly imposing, muscular man with a stern, completely unyielding, highly professional expression, walked directly straight past me, straight past Marcus, and marched completely, purposefully, right directly up to my heavily sweating, terrified father and my violently, violently shaking sister. Richard let out a loud, pathetic, high-pitched, desperate squeak, actively trying to physically scramble incredibly awkwardly backward away from the heavy wooden table, but his legs completely, entirely failed him. He collapsed heavily, miserably back down into his expensive leather chair, a totally, thoroughly broken, pathetic, ruined man. Jessica instantly, completely burst into fresh, massive, loud, hysterical, fake sobbing, desperately, loudly screaming and begging Marcus to instantly save her using his expensive legal connections. But Marcus simply stood there, perfectly silently watching her with cold, dead, absolute, heavy indifference. Richard and Jessica, the tall, imposing police officer, announced his deep, booming, authoritative voice, echoing powerfully, firmly throughout the massive, stunning, tropical glass room. You are both being placed immediately, formally, under total, absolute physical arrest. The incredibly heavy, metallic, cold, highly distinct sound of heavy steel handcuffs forcefully, violently, rapidly clicking, permanently, tightly shut, perfectly around their incredibly expensive soft wrists was the single most incredibly beautiful, deeply pure, wonderful sound I had ever heard in my entire 29 years of existence. The loud, sharp, beautiful metallic clicks completely, instantly, totally, physically severed the massive, heavy, dark chains of toxic manipulation and severe psychological abuse that had heavily, suffocatingly bound me to them for my entire deeply painful childhood. The lead officer pulled a small printed white card directly out of his dark uniform pocket and began to loudly, clearly, formally read them their strict, unyielding, absolute Miranda rights. You have the absolute right to completely, firmly remain entirely silent. He read, his voice incredibly steady and completely, totally devoid of any human sympathy. Anything you say can and absolutely heavily will be forcefully, powerfully, legally used permanently directly against you in a strict, heavy federal court of law. You are being officially, formally, federally charged with incredibly massive, multiple severe counts of heavy federal wire fraud, massive grand corporate embezzlement, and highly severe extensive legal document forgery. You have the total right to an expensive private attorney. If you cannot absolutely possibly currently afford an attorney, which, given the massive federal asset seizure notices, sitting completely, totally, heavily. Right there, directly on this table, you absolutely heavily likely cannot. One will be completely formally appointed to legally represent you. I stood completely quietly, completely peacefully watching the incredibly highly trained local police officers physically, forcefully, aggressively pull my deeply terrified, sobbing biological father and my completely, wildly hysterical, shrieking sister directly, roughly up out of their incredibly plush, expensive soft leather conference chairs. They practically forcefully, physically dragged them, aggressively, roughly, heavily, directly across the beautiful, expensive, custom-imported bamboo floor, and roughly straight, completely, entirely out of the massive, beautiful, sunny oceanfront glass boardroom. I watched their pathetic, deeply ruined, highly terrified, sweating figures completely, totally, completely, entirely disappear. Directly, completely out through the heavy, thick, solid wooden double doors, completely, officially, permanently banishing them entirely, completely, fully, entirely. Out of my new, beautiful, peaceful, highly successful, incredibly wealthy, independent life forever. The physical reality of the arrest was absolutely not like the dramatic movies. It was incredibly ugly, loudly chaotic, and deeply pathetic. Jessica violently fought against the heavy cold metal cuffs digging painfully into her delicate soft wrists. She twisted her thin body wildly, causing her incredibly expensive designer sundress to tear slightly at the shoulder. Her flawless, blonde, expensive blowout was now a frantic, tangled, messy disaster, sticking heavily to her wet, crying face. She violently screamed at the local police officers, aggressively threatening to legally sue them loudly, demanding they release her immediately because she was a wealthy, highly important, elite woman. But the highly trained officers completely, totally ignored her incredibly entitled, dramatic tantrums. They simply firmly pulled her forward with practiced, heavy physical efficiency. Richard was the exact total opposite. My biological father, who had spent my entire 29 years of life projecting absolute, terrifying, unquestionable authority, had physically completely crumpled into a hollow, empty, pathetic shell. He could barely even physically walk on his own 2 feet. 2 strong police officers had to physically, forcefully hold him entirely up by his sweating arms as they guided him slowly toward the large wooden doors. He looked back at me one final agonizing time, and I saw absolutely complete, total, empty nothingness deeply inside his dark eyes. The incredibly terrifying monster of my painful childhood was just a pathetic, completely broke, deeply ruined old man facing the rest of his miserable life inside a dark, cold federal prison cell. Just before the officers pulled them completely through the massive double doors, Jessica violently, forcefully dug her expensive designer heels deeply into the polished hardwood floor. She aggressively twisted her shaking body around and looked directly straight at Marcus. Her face was terribly smeared with dark, heavy, expensive makeup and pure, desperate, incredibly naked panic. "Marcus," she screamed, her voice cracking horribly, echoing loudly in the glass room. "You have to urgently call the best lawyers. You have to fix this massive mistake right now. Tell them it is a massive, incredible misunderstanding. You have the massive money, Marcus. You have to instantly, totally save me. Marcus slowly, deliberately stepped forward. He did not look incredibly angry anymore. He looked completely, thoroughly, entirely, coldly done. He stood completely, perfectly still, looking directly down at the deeply toxic woman who had secretly, entirely despised him, who had maliciously used him, who had deliberately forged his personal legal name to cover her massive, illegal offshore gambling debts. He did not reach his hand out to gently comfort her. He casually, slowly adjusted the crisp cuffs of his incredibly expensive tailored suit jacket and spoke in a voice so incredibly quiet and completely, deeply lethal that it instantly, smoothly cut right through all her frantic, hysterical screaming. "I am absolutely not calling anyone to help you, Jessica," he stated perfectly calmly, his voice echoing like cold, hard steel. "In fact, my highly expensive personal legal team has already been intensely working around the clock since I clearly saw the absolute undeniable hard evidence from your incredibly brilliant sister. They will completely heavily have the emergency divorce filings and the absolute full permanent child custody papers waiting for you directly inside your cold holding cell by early tomorrow morning. You will absolutely never touch a single tiny solitary dime of my hard-earned money ever again, and you will never ever see our innocent children again. Have a highly miserable, incredibly pathetic life." Jessica let out a horrifying loud sound that I had absolutely never heard a living human being make before. It was a raw, deeply agonizing, incredibly loud wail of total, absolute, permanent, devastating loss. The very last thing she clearly saw before the strong officers forcefully, successfully dragged her entirely away was her incredibly wealthy, powerful husband completely turning his broad back on her and coldly walking away. The heavy, thick wooden boardroom doors finally clicked firmly, securely shut behind them. The loud, incredibly chaotic screaming slowly, beautifully faded down the long, quiet hallway until there was absolutely nothing left inside the room but the gentle, rhythmic, incredibly peaceful sound of the Hawaiian ocean waves gently crashing against the sharp rocks outside. I stood completely quietly in the absolute center of the massive glass boardroom and let out a long, incredibly deep, cleansing breath. The suffocating, heavy, dark weight that I had been painfully carrying on my chest for 29 long, agonizing years completely, totally evaporated directly into the warm, sweet tropical air. Marcus walked slowly over to me and firmly extended his hand. We shook hands firmly, silently, powerfully, acknowledging the absolute perfect, flawless success of our heavily shared, incredibly brilliant justice. Julian, my brilliant private wealth attorney, gathered the massive, heavy federal binders and gave me a quiet, highly respectful professional nod before leading Marcus directly out of the beautiful room to completely formalize the incredibly complex corporate takeover paperwork. I was finally completely, truly, perfectly alone. I walked slowly over to the sleek, wet bar and poured myself a fresh glass of perfectly chilled vintage champagne. I slowly, peacefully walked out through the large sliding glass doors directly onto the massive sun-drenched outdoor tropical balcony. The late afternoon sun was just beautifully beginning to dip slightly lower, gently casting an incredibly beautiful, warm, brilliant golden light directly across the endless sparkling turquoise water. I leaned comfortably against the cool, smooth glass railing, taking a slow, deep, incredibly highly satisfying sip of my sweet, expensive drink. Far down below, winding smoothly along the dramatic, twisting, scenic coastal highway, I could clearly, vividly see the bright, flashing red and blue lights of the local police cruisers. I watched those tiny, flashing bright lights get smaller and smaller and smaller until they completely, entirely, smoothly disappeared directly around the dark, sharp, volcanic cliffs, beautifully taking the absolute worst, heavy, toxic parts of my entire painful past away, entirely, completely, forever. For my entire complete life, I had been deeply, heavily told I was incredibly weak. I was forcefully told I was fundamentally broken, a heavy burden, a pathetic, convenient scapegoat who simply existed only to silently, completely serve their incredibly toxic, massive, fragile egos. They deeply, firmly thought they could violently, aggressively throw me away into a freezing storm and then casually, happily reel me back in exactly whenever they desperately, incredibly, urgently needed a convenient financial victim. But they severely, completely, fatally underestimated the incredible, terrifying, massive strength of a highly intelligent woman who finally definitively decides she has absolutely entirely had completely enough. The highly toxic, incredibly heavy dragging anchors that had painfully held me down for decades were completely, entirely, permanently gone. I owned a massive, beautiful, secure estate. I had an incredibly thriving, wildly successful, independent corporate business. I had finally, powerfully, beautifully, completely reclaimed my own incredible personal narrative. I stood perfectly still, feeling the incredibly warm, sweet ocean breeze gently blowing on my face, completely, deeply, incredibly, completely peaceful. I was finally, truly, absolutely, wonderfully free. If you are listening to this exact story right now, and you somehow deeply, cleanly recognize yourself in my long, painful journey, I desperately, incredibly, truly want you to deeply hear me. You are absolutely never, ever obligated to willingly set yourself completely on fire just to keep highly toxic, entirely abusive family members comfortably warm. Setting strict, firm, incredibly permanent boundaries is absolutely not a terrible family betrayal. Choosing to fiercely, bravely protect your own quiet, mental, and heavy financial peace is absolutely not being completely selfish. It is pure, essential, beautiful, basic human survival. You absolutely, heavily, deeply, incredibly deserve to build a beautiful, safe, highly happy, successful life. Completely, entirely, incredibly free from heavily toxic people who only view you as a completely convenient, totally disposable human tool. You deeply possess so much more incredible, hidden, massive internal strength than you could ever possibly completely currently imagine. Thank you so much for beautifully, bravely staying with me until the very end of my long journey. If my story deeply, cleanly resonated with your heart today, please take an incredibly quick second to hit that like button and absolutely, completely subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories about deeply claiming your true power. I would also really incredibly deeply love to know exactly precisely where you are watching this video from right now and exactly what time it is in your beautiful part of the world. Please drop a quick friendly comment below and let me beautifully connect with you. Until next time, please always powerfully remember to perfectly confidently, unconditionally protect your own peace and always incredibly bravely, boldly, unconditionally choose yourself. I stand here now looking out at the endless horizon where the vibrant blue water meets the clear sky, and I realize something incredibly profound. For 29 long agonizing years, I was completely trapped inside a tiny dark psychological cage that my own biological family meticulously built for me. Society constantly loudly dictates that family is absolutely everything. We are aggressively taught from the very time we are tiny children that blood is fundamentally thicker than water and that you must always unconditionally forgive the people who raised you. We are told to keep the peace, to swallow our massive heavy hurt, to simply smile and quietly absorb the endless emotional shrapnel, because that is just what good, loyal daughters do. But what society never actively loudly tells you is that sometimes the people who explicitly share your exact DNA are the very same people who are quietly, securely holding the sharpest knife directly behind their backs. I spent my entire whole life desperately, violently trying to earn a specific kind of pure, unconditional love that was absolutely never, ever real. I willingly folded myself into incredibly tiny, invisible, pathetic shapes. I completely silenced my own actual voice. I happily handed over my own hard-earned money and my own bright future, all because I fundamentally, deeply believed that if I just sacrificed enough, they would finally, magically, suddenly see my true human value. I thought love was a highly complex transactional currency, and I was constantly, permanently in massive emotional debt. But pure, genuine love is absolutely not a harsh, calculated reward for being a highly convenient, useful, compliant doormat. Genuine family does not casually, happily throw you out into a freezing, dark, dangerous storm when you are no longer instantly, perfectly useful to their massive, toxic financial schemes. They do not actively, gleefully frame you for their own disgusting, massive corporate crimes, and they certainly do not eagerly, enthusiastically fly thousands of miles across an ocean just to legally steal the absolute very last, safe, pristine sanctuary you built for yourself. When you finally permanently, fiercely cut off toxic, abusive family members, people from the outside looking in will instantly, actively, aggressively call you incredibly cold. They will loudly, passionately label you entirely incredibly bitter or totally, horribly unforgiving. They will deeply, desperately try to actively, forcefully convince you that walking completely away is a massive, terrible, cruel act of ultimate dark revenge. But let me completely, deeply assure you right now, with absolute, total, crystal clear certainty, setting strict, firm, incredibly permanent, heavy boundaries is absolutely not revenge. It is pure, essential, basic human survival. Walking away from a massive, burning, highly toxic, emotional house fire is not an act of aggression against the hot, violent flames. It is simply the only highly logical way to keep yourself from completely, utterly burning alive. I do not carry a single tiny heavy ounce of lingering dark bitter hatred in my heart for Richard or Jessica. Hatred requires incredibly massive amounts of heavy, valuable daily energy, and I absolutely completely, totally refuse to surrender one more single precious tiny second of my beautiful, peaceful existence to their dark, heavy, miserable chaos. I have completely, fully, entirely forgiven them. But you need to deeply, heavily, completely understand what true, real forgiveness actually fundamentally means. Genuine, absolute forgiveness does not ever mean blindly, foolishly swinging your heavy front door completely wide open and happily letting highly toxic, heavily dangerous people walk directly right back into your beautiful, pristine home just so they can completely, violently destroy it all over again. True absolute forgiveness simply incredibly beautifully means gracefully, permanently letting go of the heavy, toxic, agonizing hope that the painful past could have ever possibly been any different. It means peacefully, beautifully, cleanly stepping entirely out of the massive, dirty, chaotic fighting ring. It perfectly, safely, beautifully means simply letting them finally, completely, heavily face the massive, incredibly dark, terrifying, permanent legal and financial consequences of their own disgusting, sick, toxic actions. While you safely, strongly, fiercely protect your own quiet, beautiful mental peace. The incredibly heavy, dark iron chains of deep, constant psychological obligation have finally, completely, successfully, totally shattered. I am no longer the incredibly weak, highly pathetic, extremely terrified, silent family scapegoat. I am the absolute, unquestionable, sovereign author of my own beautiful, magnificent, incredible destiny. I look down at my own strong, steady hands, and I absolutely marvel at exactly how much they have successfully, beautifully built, completely, entirely from absolute rock-bottom scratch. The massive, pristine walls of this $40 million Hawaiian sanctuary are not just physical blocks of stone and glass. They are the incredible, visible, undeniable, physical proof of my own massive internal, untouchable strength. Every single peaceful, quiet, tropical morning, I wake up breathing the deeply clean, incredibly sweet island air is a beautiful, pure, massive, total victory. I completely, fully, actively reject the toxic, heavy narrative that was incredibly, forcefully, violently assigned to me at birth. If my incredibly long, highly painful personal story deeply resonated with you today, I want you to truly, heavily hear me right this exact second. If you have ever been violently forced to painfully, permanently cut off a highly toxic biological family member just to completely, finally, safely save your own beautiful mind and your own precious life, I see you completely, and I firmly, totally stand incredibly proudly with you. You are absolutely not alone in this heavy, difficult journey. Please take an incredibly quick, warm moment to deeply, firmly hit that like button and absolutely, totally subscribe to the channel for many more incredibly powerful, deeply inspiring stories of completely surviving heavy trauma and beautifully, incredibly thriving afterward. And right exactly now, I genuinely, completely want to hear directly from you. Have you ever been the completely heavy, tragic, convenient, emotional scapegoat in your own biological family? How did you finally, bravely, beautifully, loudly break, entirely, completely free from that heavy, dark, incredibly toxic, painful role? Please drop your own beautiful, amazing story directly down in the comments below right now. And please, absolutely do not forget to explicitly, wonderfully, clearly tell me exactly perfectly where you are watching this video from today and exactly precisely what time it is there in your beautiful part of the world. Please, deeply, incredibly warmly take wonderful, complete, absolute care of yourself today. because you fundamentally, absolutely, incredibly, magically, completely deserve to be unconditionally, heavily, fully, completely, beautifully chosen.